Welcome to ScareZone. Tonight we bring you hours of true horror stories to help you relax, sleep, or simply enjoy the atmosphere. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. Now, close your eyes and let the rain begin.
The night Caleb Farrow first saw Serafina Bridger, the sky over Dunning's Hollow was the color of a week-old bruise, and something in him broke that would never mend right again. He was 23 that autumn of 1847 when word came down from the ridge that Judge Bridger's daughter had taken to her bed with a wasting sickness. He'd seen her only twice before, once at the Harvest Festival, where she'd worn a dress the color of morning glories and moved through the crowd like something not quite of this earth. Once more through the window of her father's carriage, her face pale as milk behind the glass, her dark eyes finding his for a moment that stretched like taffy and left him standing in the road long after the dust had settled. That second time she had smiled at him, or he thought she had. A small curve of pale lips, there and gone like lightning, and he'd carried that smile with him for months afterward, turning it over in his mind like a river stone worn smooth by obsession. The Appalachian Princess, people called her, though never within earshot of her father. Judge Orrin Bridger presided over the county court with cold efficiency, and those who came before his bench learned quickly that mercy was not among his virtues. 3 men had swung from the gallows in the past year alone, and it was said the judge watched each execution from his office window, sipping coffee as the trapdoors fell. But for all his power, Orrin Bridger could not command his daughter's health to return. Caleb told himself it was none of his concern. The Bridgers occupied a different world than the Farrows. Yet he found himself walking past the Bridger house each evening, his boots finding the long route home that wound past the wrought iron gates. Once he saw Dr. Hadley leaving by the front door, his face gray with exhaustion, and something that looked like defeat. It was on the 7th evening of his vigil that the gate was open. Caleb stopped, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. The gate had never been opened before. It hung ajar by perhaps a foot, and beyond it the gravel drive curved toward the mansion, like an invitation or a trap. He should have walked on. Every reasonable part of his mind screamed at him to continue down the road, to return to his family's small farmhouse and the life that awaited him there. But something had taken hold of him in the weeks since Serafina's illness began, something that felt less like love and more like possession. And before he could think better of it, his hand was on the iron and his feet were carrying him up the drive. The house loomed above him, 3 stories of weathered brick. A single light burned in a room on the 2nd floor, and as Caleb watched, a shadow passed behind the curtain. Slim, feminine, moving with the slow, terrible grace of the very ill. He found the trellis without knowing he was looking for it. Then he was climbing, his muscles remembering the trees of his boyhood, carrying him up through the darkness toward that solitary light. Halfway up, his hand closed around a thorn he hadn't seen, and blood welled hot against his palm. He didn't stop. The pain felt right somehow, like a tithe paid for passage into a world where he didn't belong. The window was open a crack, and through it came a smell that made Caleb's stomach clench, the sour, sweet odor of a body consuming itself. But underneath it was something else, something his mind refused to identify, like meat left too long in the summer sun. He pushed the window open and climbed inside. The room was suffocating, heated by a fire that blazed despite the mildness of the evening. Candles burned on every surface, dozens of them, as if someone believed that enough light could hold back what was coming. And there, in a bed large enough for 3, lay Serafina Bridger. She was not as he remembered her. The morning glory beauty had faded, leaving something gaunt and hollowed. Her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink, framing a face that seemed to have collapsed inward, the cheekbones standing out like accusations beneath skin gone the color of old parchment. Her eyes, when they opened, were black as the bottom of a well. Instead of fleeing, he knelt beside her bed and took her hand. It was cold. So cold that his fingers ached with it, despite the roaring fire. And the smell was stronger here, that terrible sweetness his mind kept trying to name and his heart kept refusing to hear. "You're the boy who watches the house." Her voice was a whisper, dry as autumn leaves. Her fingers tightened on his with a terrible strength that seemed impossible given the wasted form before him. "What do you want, farm boy?" "I want you to live." She laughed, an awful sound, wet and rattling, before dissolving into a coughing fit. When it passed, there were flecks of something dark on the white linens. Not blood, Caleb realized with a distant horror. Something darker, something that looked almost like soil. "The doctors have tried everything. Leeches, mercury, prayer." She turned her head, and for just a moment, in the flickering candlelight, he thought he saw something moving beneath the skin of her throat. A rippling, like snakes beneath a thin blanket. Then she shifted and it was gone. "I'm rotten from the inside out. There's a woman in the Hollis. People say she can cure anything." The witch. Fear flickered in those black eyes, the first genuine emotion he'd seen there. "My father had her run out of town. Cursed him from the back of the wagon. Said his line would end in blood and silence if he found out you were speaking of her. Then he won't find out. I can bring you to her. Tonight." "Why? Why would you risk everything for a girl you don't even know?" "Because I love you," he wanted to say. "Because from the moment I saw you, something in me knew that my life would be meaningless without you in it." Instead, he said, "Because no one else will." Something shifted in her eyes. The fear was still there, but alongside it now was something else. A hunger that made him think of wolves watching a wounded deer. Later he would remember that look. Later he would understand what it meant. But in that moment, kneeling beside her bed with his bloodied palm pressed against her frozen fingers, he saw only a dying girl who needed saving. Then we'd better hurry. The journey into the hollers took 3 days. Caleb had stolen a horse from his father's barn. Old Moloch, a gray draft horse past his prime but steady on the mountain trails. They traveled by night to avoid the search parties. Judge Bridger was not a man who would accept his daughter's disappearance quietly, and by the second day they could hear dogs baying in the valleys below. But Caleb knew these mountains. He led Serafina through passes that weren't on any map, along trails that existed only in the memory of the land itself. The dogs lost their scent at the creek crossing. Serafina grew weaker as they climbed. The cold that radiated from her body seemed to intensify with each mile, and at night, when Caleb wrapped himself around her to share warmth, he felt it seeping into his bones like poison. Sometimes she cried out in her sleep, words in a language he didn't recognize, her hands clawing at the air. Once he woke to find her standing at the edge of their camp, staring into the darkness with her head cocked at an angle that made his spine crawl, as if listening to something only she could hear. When he called her name, she turned, and for just a moment, her eyes caught the moonlight wrong, reflecting it back like an animal's. "Bad dream," she whispered, and let him lead her back to their bedroll. On the third morning, the forest changed. The trees grew closer together, their branches interweaving overhead until the sky became a memory, glimpsed through gaps in a dark ceiling. The undergrowth thinned and died, leaving bare earth the color of old rust. No birds sang, no insects hummed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then they found the witch's cabin. It sat in a hollow between two ridges, a squat building of rough-hewn logs with a roof of sod. The clearing around it was dotted with wooden frames hung with bones and feathers, circles of stones with ashes at their centers, a scarecrow that wore a dress and had no face. Caleb noticed that nothing grew within 10 feet of the cabin's walls. Not a weed, not a blade of grass, as if the earth itself was afraid to get too close. An old woman sat on the porch shelling beans. She looked up as they emerged from the tree line, her eyes, one blue, one milky white, fixing on them without surprise. "Been expecting you. The farm boy and the princess. Bring her inside." The cabin's interior was thick with the smell of herbs and something like graveyards after rain. Bundles of dried plants hung from the ceiling. Jars lined the shelves, filled with things Caleb didn't want to examine. Shapes that might have been organs, liquids the color of old blood. In the corner, a spinning wheel sat motionless, its spindle wound with threads so dark it seemed to drink the light. The witch bent over Seraphina, her gnarled fingers probing with a physician's confidence. She made a sound in her throat, and when she looked at Caleb, there was something in her mismatched eyes he couldn't read. Pity, perhaps, or warning. "You know what she is, boy. She's the woman I love." The witch laughed, dry leaves rattling in a storm. "Love is a blindfold, boy. It keeps you from seeing what's right in front of your face. Can you cure her? I can cure her. Make her more beautiful than she's ever been. But there's a price. There's always a price. Name it." "Beauty is a mask for the starving." The witch's smile held something ancient and terribly sad. "Remember that when the time comes. You can't unring a bell." She extended one withered hand. "The price will be whatever I name, whenever I name it. Do we have a bargain?" He took it without hesitation. Her skin was paper dry, hot as fever, and when their palms touched, Caleb felt something pass between them. A current, a promise, a seal on a contract, written in languages older than words. The ritual took 3 hours. Caleb was banished to the porch where he sat among the bone chimes and faceless scarecrows listening, chanting, low and rhythmic, in that same language Seraphina had spoken in her sleep. A smell like burning hair, and once, just once, a scream, high and thin and inhuman, that cut off so abruptly it left his ears ringing. He started to rise, to go to her, but something held him in place. Not a physical force, but a certainty, bone deep and absolute, that if he opened that door before he was called, he would see something that would break him. So he waited, and watched the shadows lengthen across the clearing, and tried not to think about what he had agreed to. When the witch finally opened the door, she looked older, diminished, as if the ritual had taken something that wouldn't be given back. Her mismatched eyes found his, and in them he saw exhaustion and triumph and something else, a sadness so vast it made his breath catch. "It's done," she said. "Go see what you bought." Seraphina was sitting up in bed. Her skin had lost its parchment quality, had taken on a flush that seemed almost luminous in the cabin's dim light. Her dark hair cascaded over shoulders that no longer bore the sharp edges of bone, and her eyes, her black, bottomless eyes, were fixed on him with an expression that made his breath catch. "Caleb, you saved me." He went to her, took her hands and found them warm, warm for the first time, and soft and strong. She smiled up at him, and it was like watching the sun rise, and he understood that he would do anything to keep that smile on her face. The bloodied cut on his palm throbbed where their skin touched, but he didn't pull away. The pain still felt right. A small price for what he'd gained. Behind him, the witch said, "Don't thank me yet, boy. The gratitude might curdle before long. But Caleb wasn't listening. He was lost in Seraphina's eyes, in the warmth of her hands, in the impossible miracle of her resurrection. And if he noticed the way the witch watched them, her mismatched eyes tracking Seraphina's every movement with the wariness of a farmer watching a fox near the henhouse, he told himself it meant nothing. Outside, the bone chimes sang in a wind that hadn't been there before, and somewhere in the darkness of the holler, something howled. Not a wolf, not a dog, something older, something that sounded almost like laughter. They stayed in the hollow for 2 weeks. The days blurred together in a haze of discovery, each morning bringing new revelation of Seraphina's transformation. Her beauty had become something almost unbearable to look upon. Not just restored, but amplified, as if the sickness had been a chrysalis, and this radiant creature the butterfly that emerged. Her skin seemed to glow with inner light. When she laughed, the sound echoed off the mountains like bells, and when she touched him, Caleb felt as though he were burning from the inside out. The witch watched it all with an expression Caleb chose not to examine. She provided for them. Meals of rabbit and squirrel, vegetables from her strange garden where plants grew in colors that didn't exist in nature. Seraphina ate voraciously at first, her delicate hands tearing at the meat, her white teeth flashing. She ate like someone who had been starving for years, not weeks. She ate like someone making up for lost time. But as the days passed, her appetite shifted. She would push away plates, her black eyes wandering to the darkness beyond the window. Sometimes Caleb caught her standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, her head tilted at that wrong angle, listening to something only she could hear. When he asked what she was doing, she smiled and said nothing, and the smile never quite reached her eyes. On the 5th night, Caleb woke to find her side of the bed empty and cold. He found her behind the cabin, kneeling in the moonlight beside the carcass of a rabbit. Its body was intact. No marks, no wounds, but something was wrong with it. The fur had gone gray and brittle, and when Caleb stepped closer, he saw that the eyes had sunk into the skull, the flesh pulling tight against the bones as if every drop of moisture had been drawn out, as if something had drunk it dry. Seraphina looked up at him. There was something dark at the corner of her mouth. "It was already dead when I found it," she said. Caleb nodded. He didn't believe her. He didn't want to believe her. And so he chose to accept the lie, to fold it into the growing collection of things he refused to see. "Come back to bed," he said. She smiled and followed him and didn't mention the rabbit again. The night before they left, Caleb woke to an empty bed once more. The moon was full. He found her standing at the edge of the woods, her white nightgown luminous, her head tilted back as if drinking in the darkness. As he watched, she lifted one hand to her lips, and the movement made his stomach clench. She turned. The moonlight caught her face, and for just a moment, her features seemed wrong, the angles too sharp, the mouth too wide, the eyes reflecting light like a cat's. Then she smiled, and she was just Seraphina again. Behind her, at the edge of the woods, something lay in a heap of brown fur and twisted limbs, a deer, perhaps, though no steam rose from the carcass in the cool night air, though the body looked shrunken, collapsed, as if hollowed out from within. Caleb looked away before he could see too much. They arrived back in Dunning's Hollow on a morning thick with fog. Notices had been posted throughout the county. Rewards for information, threats for those who sheltered the kidnappers. But Seraphina walked into her father's house with her head high and her beauty blazing, and within hours the notices were coming down, and Caleb Farrow was being fitted for a suit to wear to his own engagement party. He saw the judge's face when Seraphina entered the parlor. saw the flash of something that wasn't relief, wasn't joy, something that looked almost like recognition, like a man seeing a nightmare he'd thought he'd escaped. But then Serafina was in her father's arms, and the judge was weeping, and Caleb told himself he'd imagined it. It started small, a chicken coop on the outskirts. Birds found dead one morning, drained of blood. The farmer's wife swore they looked mummified, dried out like jerky left in the sun too long. A dog missing from the blacksmith's yard, found 3 days later behind the church, reduced to fur and bones with no sign of what had consumed the flesh. A goat vanished from Pastor Whitfield's farm. When they found it, the pastor's son vomited into the bushes and wouldn't say what he'd seen. People blamed wolves, coyotes, the general wildness of the mountains. Then the Garrett boy disappeared. Ezekiel Garrett was 15. He'd gone to check his traps along the creek and never came home. The search parties found what was left of him on the third day. And what they found was so disturbing that the men refused to speak of it, even to their wives. But rumors spread anyway. They always do. The body had been hollowed out, some whispered, like something had scooped out everything inside and left only the skin. Judge Bridger declared it a bear attack from the courthouse steps. Caleb stood at the edge of the crowd and thought about the deer in the moonlight, the way Serafina looked at people, the hungry, evaluating way a farmer looks at livestock, the way she'd started touching people when she spoke to them, a hand on an arm, a brush of fingers against a cheek, and the way those people would stumble afterward, suddenly pale, suddenly tired, as if she'd drawn something out of them with that simple contact. That night he found her in the garden staring at the moon. "Where were you the night the Garrett boy went missing?" She turned, her smile patient. "In my bed, darling. Where else?" And somehow he was tired. The questions faded like morning mist. When she led him to his chambers, he went without protest. And if he dreamed of the Garrett boy's face, of eyes that had seen something terrible before the end, he didn't remember it when he woke. He woke to screaming. The sound tore through the house like a blade. Caleb stumbled into the hallway, following it to the kitchen. The cook, Bonnie Dwyer, stood in the doorway, her face white, her hands pressed over her mouth. Behind her, on the stone floor, lay the judge's manservant, a freed black man named Hosea who had served the family for 20 years. What was left of him? Caleb knelt beside the body, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. Hosea's eyes were frozen in an expression of perfect terror. His throat had been torn out. Not cut, but torn, as if by something with jaws strong enough to rip through muscle and tendon. And his chest was open. His chest was empty. The cavity gaped like a mouth. The ribs splayed outward, and inside there was nothing. Not organs, not blood. Just a hollow darkness that seemed to go deeper than anatomy should allow. "What's happened here?" Judge Bridger's voice cut through the kitchen like a winter wind. He strode into the room, still in his nightclothes, his gray hair wild. Behind him came Serafina, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, her expression one of perfect, innocent shock. "Father, what happened to Hosea?" But Caleb was watching the judge, watching the way his eyes moved, not to the body, not to the blood, not to the gaping cavity of Hosea's chest, but to Serafina's mouth, just for a fraction of a second, a flicker of attention so brief it might have been nothing at all, except for the expression that accompanied it. Pure abject terror. The look of a man who has built his entire life around containing something he knows will one day consume him. The look of a man watching his worst fears come true. Then it was gone, and Judge Bridger was bellowing orders, and Serafina was pressing against Caleb's shoulder, her body trembling with what appeared to be shock, but Caleb had seen. and he could not unsee. Later, when the chaos had settled and the body had been removed, Caleb found himself studying Serafina's hands, her perfect, delicate hands, clasped demurely at her waist. There was something dark under her fingernails, and when she caught him looking, she smiled, a small, private smile that contained nothing of the innocent girl she pretended to be, and slowly, deliberately, raised one finger to her lips. "It's the witch." The words came from Caleb's mouth before he could stop them, and the moment they were spoken, he knew them for what they were. Not truth, not even suspicion, just the desperate attempt to look anywhere but at what was right in front of his face. Judge Bridger seized on it like a drowning man grasping a rope. The witch had cursed this family. Now people were dying. Within the hour, a search party was riding for the Hollers. They reached the cabin by midday. The old woman who emerged onto the porch looked smaller, grayer, as if the weeks had aged her years. The bone chimes hung silent around her, and the faceless scarecrow had fallen over, its dress pooling in the dust as like shed skin. "Came sooner than I expected," she said, her mismatched eyes finding Caleb in the crowd. But then, the hunger's always stronger than folks think. As the men bound her, she caught his eye and held it. There was no accusation in her gaze, no anger, only a vast, weary sadness. "You want to know the truth, boy? Come find me before the trial." The trial was held 2 days later. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. The curse she'd spoken, the pattern of deaths. The townspeople packed the courthouse, their faces tight with fear and the particular hunger that comes when people smell blood and call it justice. Serafina sat in the front row, her face a mask of righteous fury. Caleb sat beside her and felt the cold radiating from her body like winter itself. She had been cold again lately, he realized. Not as cold as during her illness, but no longer the warmth she'd shown after the cure. As if whatever fire had been kindled in her was burning through its fuel faster than expected. When asked for final words, the witch raised her head. Her white hair hung lank around her face, and bruises purpled her cheekbones where the men had been less than gentle. But her voice, when she spoke, carried to every corner of the room. "The guilty are not always the ones who wear the chains. Beauty is a mask for the starving." She smiled through broken teeth. "Ask your future son-in-law what that means, Judge." The courtroom erupted. Through it all, Caleb watched Serafina's face shift, just for a moment, into something not quite human. The bones seemed to move beneath her skin. Her jaw flexed in a way that jaws shouldn't flex. Then she was beautiful again, perfect again, and Caleb wondered if he was losing his mind. That night, after the death sentence was pronounced, he slipped away to the jail. The witch was waiting for him, her mismatched eyes gleaming in the lantern light. The cell was small and damp, and she sat in its corner like a spider in a web, patient and still. "Tell me what she is." "You know what a sin-eater is, boy. Not the folk tradition. The real thing. There are families in these mountains who carry the gift. They don't eat bread to take away sins." She leaned forward and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "They eat sinners. Body and soul both." Caleb's stomach heaved. "Serafina is Judge Bridger's daughter. Serafina is the last of the Bridger line for a reason. Her mother died in childbirth, or so the story goes. Truth is, Orrin Bridger smothered her when he realized what she was, what she'd made his daughter into. The witch's hands twisted in her chains. He came to me afterward, begged me to suppress the hunger, told me what would happen if I failed, what had happened to his wife's family back in the old country. Villages empty, bloodlines erased, the stories they told to keep children in their beds, the sickness, the wasting. It wasn't sickness. It was starvation. I'd been feeding her magic for 17 years, keeping the hunger locked away. But the spells were failing. She was waking up. The witch rose, pressing her face against the bars. What you saw as decay was her true nature, clawing its way to the surface. And when you made your bargain, I gave you exactly what you asked for. I let her become what she was always meant to be. Why? Because you asked me to? Because the price I named was my life at the end. And because part of me wanted to know if love could conquer even this. She told him the rest. The Sin Eaters were predators. Apex predators, older than the mountains. They fed on guilt, on transgression. The worse the sin, the sweeter the meat. Judge Bridger had been feeding his daughter for years, fattening up sinners in his merciless court, while the witch's magic kept her from knowing what she truly was. The Garrett boy, Hosea. They can't have been sinners? Oh, they were. Dark ones. The kind that call out to a hungry thing in the night. The witch's smile was bitter. Why do you think she hasn't touched you yet, boy? You're too clean. Too innocent. There's not enough guilt on your soul to make a satisfying meal. She paused, and her smile turned sad. Though that's changing, isn't it? Every day you stay silent. Every death you look away from. You're seasoning yourself, boy. Getting ready for the feast. Caleb backed away. There must be some way to stop her. There's no turning back from what she is. The best you could hope for is suppression. A cage for the beast. But I'm the only one who knows how to build that cage, and come sunrise, they're going to hang me. Then kill her, the witch said. Iron through the heart. It's the only way. I love her. The witch laughed, bones breaking, hope dying. Then you're already dead, boy. You just don't know it yet. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chambers watching the candle burn down, trying to reconcile what the witch had told him with the morning glory girl at the harvest festival. The pale face behind the carriage window. The wasted form in the candlelit bedroom. But the pieces fit. That was the horror of it. They fit too well. The cold that radiated from her body. The way she ate, ravenously at first, then not at all, as if ordinary food had become meaningless. The hollowed-out animals. The way she touched people and left them pale and tired. The way Judge Bridger looked at her. The terrible recognition in his eyes. The way she had looked at Caleb himself from the very beginning. Not with love, he realized now, but with evaluation. Measuring. Calculating. He thought about the gate that had been open. The window that had been unlatched. The trellis positioned so perfectly beneath her room. Not coincidence, not fate. A trap, baited with a dying girl and sprung with a desperate boy's love. Dawn came gray and cold, and with it the sound of hammering from the courthouse square. Serafina was waiting in the foyer, resplendent in crimson, her dark hair swept up to reveal the graceful column of her throat. You visited the witch last night. It wasn't a question. Her black eyes fixed on him, and something ancient moved in their depths. She told me what you are. And what am I? A sin eater. A monster. Such ugly words. She moved closer. Or have you simply been lying to yourself? You knew, Caleb. From the moment you climbed through my window. The smell, the cold. The way I looked at everyone. She leaned close. You saw the wolf, and you called it a lamb. The witch can suppress it again. The witch is going to die. And then there will be no one left who knows how to build my cage. Her smile sharpened. I've been planning this for 17 years. Ever since I understood what my father did to my mother. The witch thought she was saving me. My father thought he was controlling me. You thought you were rescuing me. She laughed, huh? sound nothing like bells anymore. You are all just pieces on my board. I'll stop you. Who will believe you? The kidnapper who brought me to a witch's cabin? She crossed to the window, gazing at the gallows. Besides, you're not going to tell anyone, because despite everything, you still love me. Caleb opened his mouth to deny it, but all he found was the awful, aching truth. She was a monster. She was a predator. She had used him, manipulated him, made him complicit in murder. And yet some part of him, some broken, ruined part, still thrilled at the sight of her, still ached when she drew near, still wanted her, even knowing what she was. And that was the worst part. That was the horror that would haunt him until his dying day. Go to the execution, Caleb. Watch the witch die, and then come back to me. The execution drew the whole town. Caleb stood at the edge of the crowd as they brought the witch out in chains. She walked with her head high, her mismatched eyes scanning faces until they found his. She smiled, small and sad and without blame. They led her up the stairs, positioned her over the trap door, fitted the rope around her neck. Any last words? Her voice carried across the square. The princess will feed tonight, and every night after, and you. Her eyes found Caleb. Will be the first course, or the last. The choice has always been yours. The trapdoor fell. Caleb watched her body swing, watched her mismatched eyes go dark, watched the last person who could have saved them all die on the end of a rope. Behind him, Serafina laughed. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, crimson gown blazing, her face radiant with joy. Around her, people parted instinctively, the way prey animals part before a predator they can't quite see. It's done, she said. It's finally done. Caleb looked at her. The creature he'd loved, the monster he'd freed, and felt something break inside him. I'm going to stop you. Are you? I don't know how, but I swear to God, I will. Brave words from a man who can't bring himself to walk away. She touched his cheek. I'm going to give you a choice, Caleb, because I do love you in my way. Stay with me. Be my prince. Help me hunt. Help me cull the sinners. Do that, and I'll never hurt you. We'll grow old together, and when you die, it will be in your bed, surrounded by children who will never know what their mother truly is. And if I refuse? Her smile sharpened. Her eyes went dark, and her face shifted, becoming something with too many angles, too many teeth. Then you become the first course, and your family becomes the second. Caleb stared at her, and he made his choice. 3 months passed. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss in Dunning's Hollow. Judge Bridger's daughter married the Pharaoh boy in a ceremony that was the talk of the county. The princess and the farmer, love conquering all. They moved into the east wing of the Bridger mansion, and Serafina's beauty became the stuff of legend, drawing visitors from as far as Richmond to catch a glimpse of the radiant bride. The disappearances continued, of course, but they were discreet now, careful. A drifter here, a criminal there, sinners and outcasts who wouldn't be missed. Judge Bridger's court remained merciless, his sentences severe, and if more condemned men vanished from their cells before their execution dates, well, that was simply the Lord's work being done ahead of schedule. Caleb watched it all with hollow eyes. He'd tried to fight her those first few weeks, tried to find silver, iron, anything that might work against her, tried to warn people, to make them see. But Serafina had been right. No one believed him. The farm boy who'd stolen the princess, now claiming she was a monster, clearly his guilt had driven him mad. And there was another truth, too, a darker one. A truth that kept him awake at night, that whispered to him in the small hours when Serafina lay beside him. Her cold beauty pressed against his warmth. He still loved her. Despite everything, the deaths, the lies, the horror. Some part of him still thrilled when she entered a room, still caught his breath when she smiled, still ached for her touch, even knowing what those hands had done, what that mouth had consumed. Love, the witch had said, is a blindfold. And Caleb had tied his own so tight he could never take it off. It was on a night in late January that everything came undone. The snow had been falling for 3 days, burying the hollow under a blanket of white, trapping the townspeople in their homes. Caleb sat by the fire in the mansion's great room, watching the flames dance, trying not to think about the sounds he'd heard from the basement the night before. The wet sounds, the screaming. Serafina entered like a ghost, her white gown trailing behind her, her dark hair unbound. She crossed to him, settled into his lap, pressed her cold lips to his throat. "I'm hungry," she whispered. "There's food in the kitchen." Not that kind of hungry. Her teeth grazed his skin, and he felt the sharpness of them, felt the points that hadn't been there before. The snow has made hunting difficult. The sinners are all locked away in their cozy homes, and I can't reach them. Her tongue traced his pulse. "But you're here, and you have sins of your own, don't you, Caleb?" He went rigid. "You promised. You said you'd never—" "I promised I'd never hurt you if you helped me, if you were my prince." Her black eyes found his, and in them he saw the hunger, vast and terrible, and utterly without mercy. "But you haven't been helping, have you? You've been plotting, planning, trying to find a way to stop me." She smiled, and her mouth was too wide, too full of teeth. "Did you think I wouldn't know? Did you think I couldn't smell the betrayal on you?" "Serafina, I've been patient with you, my love. So patient. Because I do care for you in my way. Because you freed me when no one else would." Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulled his head back, exposed his throat. "But patience has limits. Even mine." "Wait." Caleb's voice came out strangled, desperate. "Wait. You can't. The others, the sinners, they won't be snowed in forever. If you kill me now, you'll lose your prince, your partner. You'll be alone again." "I've always been alone." Her breath was cold against his skin, even when I was dying, even when you held me. Always, always alone. She pulled back, studied his face with those bottomless eyes. "Do you know what the worst part is? I actually thought you might be different. Thought you might learn to love what I am, not just what I pretend to be." "I can try, I can—" "No." The word was final, absolute. "You can't. I see that now. You'll never stop fighting. Never stop trying to be the hero." She rose from his lap, moved to the window, stared out at the falling snow. "So I'm going to give you one last gift, Caleb Farrow. One last kindness. For the boy who climbed through my window." "What gift?" She turned, and her face was different now, softer, sadder, almost human. "The truth about what happened to the witch." Caleb felt his heart stutter. "What do you mean?" "I mean she didn't just die, my love. She wasn't just hanged." Serafina's voice was gentle, almost tender. "She gave herself to me. Offered herself as payment for the bargain you made. And with her death, with her sacrifice, she gave me something I never had before." "What?" "Choice." Serafina crossed back to him, knelt before his chair, took his hands in hers. "The hunger is still there. It always will be. But the witch's magic, her last gift, gave me the power to direct it, to choose who I consume and who I spare." Her thumbs traced circles on his palms. "I chose to spare you, Caleb. Night after night, When the hunger howled and your sins called out to me, I chose to let you live. My sins. The witch's murder. Seraphina's eyes held his. You killed her, my love. Not the rope. Not my father. You. Your bargain. Your demand. Your refusal to see the truth until it was too late. She smiled, and it was almost kind. That's the real reason I let you live. Because your guilt, your beautiful, terrible guilt, has been sustaining me. Every time you lie awake at night, hating yourself for what you did, I feed. Every time you look at me and see the monster you created, I grow stronger. Caleb felt tears streaming down his face. Then why tell me? Why reveal? Because the guilt only works if you don't know. She rose, backed away from him, and her face was changing now, shifting, becoming something else. Now that you understand, now that you see clearly, the guilt will fade. You'll tell yourself you were tricked, manipulated, a victim, not a perpetrator. The thing that had been Seraphina smiled with too many teeth. And when the guilt fades, so does my reason to keep you alive. Seraphina, please. I did love you, Caleb. As much as something like me can love. Her voice was distorting, becoming deeper, older, stranger. Remember that at the end. Remember that once for a little while we were almost human together. She came for him. Seraphina didn't transform, she unfolded. Her face split along invisible seams, opening to reveal something that had never been human. The beauty fell away like a mask pulled free, and beneath it was the truth she'd hidden for 17 years. Her jaw unhinged with a wet crack that echoed through the room. Her mouth gaped wide, wider than physics allowed, wider than anatomy permitted, revealing rows of teeth that spiraled back into her throat, like the ridges inside a serpent's gullet. And beyond them was a void that consumed light itself, a darkness so absolute it hurt to look at, a hunger given form. Her eyes multiplied, split, became dozens scattered across the ruins of her face, all fixed on him, all watching, all wanting. They were still beautiful, those eyes, still black as the bottom of a well, but there were too many of them now, and they blinked in patterns that made no sense. And behind them was an intelligence older than the mountains themselves. Caleb made it 3 steps before something wrapped around his ankle and pulled. He crashed to the floor, felt himself being dragged toward that impossible mouth. The carpet burned beneath his scrabbling fingers. His nails tore, leaving bloody tracks. He screamed, but the sound seemed to die before it reached the walls, swallowed by the void that waited for him. Wait. The word tore itself from his throat. I have sins. Guilt. The thing paused. The countless eyes blinked in unison. Show me. And Caleb began to confess. The money he'd stolen from his father. $20 from the strongbox, spent on a ring he'd planned to give Seraphina, back when he thought love could save them both. The lie on his mother's deathbed, telling her he'd marry the merchant's daughter, knowing even as he spoke the words that he would break them. The girl in the next county he'd promised to marry before he saw Seraphina through a carriage window. Poor, trusting Abigail, who still wore his ring and still wrote him letters he burned without reading. And the darker things, the jealousy that ate at him when other men looked at Seraphina, the rage that flared when his father questioned his choices, the hate he felt for Judge Bridger, cold and patient, a hate that sometimes imagined the old man's death in vivid, terrible detail. He confessed it all, every sin, every shame, every secret thought he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. He talked until his throat was raw, and his voice was a whisper until there was nothing left but the truth of who he was. Not the hero he'd imagined himself to be, but a weak and selfish and deeply flawed man who had doomed everyone he touched. When he fell silent, Serafina's mouth closed. Her face settled, not to beauty, but to something almost human. The eyes merged, became two. Your guilt runs deeper than I knew. She knelt beside him, stroking his hair with a hand that had 5 fingers again, that wore the ring he'd stolen for her. You're too valuable to consume. Your guilt is a feast that keeps replenishing itself. Every sin you confessed, every shame you admitted, they're growing now, festering. They'll never stop. So I live, as my harvest, my garden of guilt. She leaned close, and her breath was cold against his face, cold as the grave, cold as the void behind her teeth. You'll never know peace. Every morning, you'll remember what you've done. Every night, you'll add new sins to the tally. And I'll be there always feeding on your suffering. She kissed his forehead. Her lips burned like ice. I'm going hunting. Don't wait up, my prince. The door closed behind her. Caleb lay on the floor for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind howled around the mansion, and the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, something screamed and then stopped screaming. Everything he'd believed, ashes now. Everything he'd hoped for, gone. But somewhere in him, a spark burned. Not hope. Something harder. The witch had said there was a way. Iron through the heart. He rose on shaking legs and walked to the fireplace. The poker hung on its hook. Black iron forged in the smithy at the edge of town. He lifted it, felt its weight in his hand, thought about what it would mean to use it, to wait by the door until she returned glutted and slow, to drive the iron through her heart before she could unfold again. Murder. Salvation. The words felt the same now. Or he could accept her terms, live as her garden of guilt forever. The choice had always been his. She returned at dawn, her crimson gown stained dark in places, her face radiant with satiation. Caleb was sitting by the dead fire, the poker across his knees. He hadn't moved all night, hadn't slept, had simply sat there, feeling the weight of the iron in his hands running through the motion in his mind. Rise, swing, strike. 3 simple movements that would end everything. 3 simple movements he wasn't sure he could make. Serafina paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. The dead fire, the poker, the hollowed expression on his face. She smiled, and even now, even after everything, the smile made his breath catch. You waited up. She crossed the room, settled into his lap as if the poker weren't there. She looked almost human, almost like the girl he'd first seen at the Harvest Festival. The girl in the morning glory dress who'd moved through the crowd like something not quite of this earth. You already know. Iron through the heart. She leaned close, her cold lips brushing his ear. Is that why you're holding the poker? Yes. Then do it. She spread her arms, offering herself. Strike now while I'm full and slow. That's what you want, isn't it? To be the hero at last? Caleb's hand tightened on the poker. His arm tensed. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to move, to strike, to end this nightmare once and for all. One motion, one thrust. And she would be gone, and the town would be safe, and he would be free. But he couldn't. Because in that moment, unbidden and unwanted, a memory rose up and drowned him. Serafina behind the glass of her father's carriage, her face pale as milk, her dark eyes finding his across the dust of the road, the way the world had gone silent, the way his heart had stopped, the way he'd known with absolute certainty that his life before that moment had been a prelude, and everything after would be defined by this woman he'd never met. That was what stayed his hand. Not the monster before him. Not the horror he'd witnessed. but the ghost of a girl behind glass, a girl who had never existed, who had been nothing but bait on a hook, a beautiful mask over a starving void. He loved a memory, and he couldn't kill it. The poker clattered to the floor. There it is. She cupped his face in her cold hands, and her smile was almost tender, almost human, almost the smile of the girl he'd loved. You could have killed me. You had the weapon, the opportunity, the knowledge of what I truly am, and you chose not to. Do you understand what that means? Caleb said nothing. There was nothing left to say. You're mine. Completely. Forever. Not because I forced you, but because you chose it. Because even staring into the abyss, even holding the weapon that could destroy it, you decided you'd rather fall than fight. Tears streamed down his face. Hot and salt and useless. What happens now? Now we begin our real life together. She rose, crossed to the window, gazed out at the snow-covered hollow where people were beginning to stir, beginning their ordinary days, unaware of the monster in their midst. You'll help me hunt, choose the sinners, deliver them to me. And in return, I'll let you keep your guilt. That beautiful, nourishing guilt that sustains us both. And if I ever change my mind, if I ever find the strength to She turned. Her face shifted, splitting along those invisible seams, revealing the darkness beneath. The countless eyes blinked in the pale light of dawn. The spiral teeth gleamed. Then I'll eat you anyway. Slowly. Over years and years and years, one piece at a time, until there's nothing left but a husk that remembers it used to be a man. The voice that emerged was not human, had never been human. The choice has always been yours, my prince. I've just been waiting for you to make it. The thing that had been Serafina crossed the room, knelt before him, took his shaking hands in hers. And then impossibly she smiled. A human smile. The smile of the morning glory girl he'd first seen at the Harvest Festival, the girl he'd climbed through a window to save, the girl who had never existed at all. My prince. Her voice was music again, honey again, everything he'd ever wanted. My beautiful, broken prince. We're going to be so happy together. She opened her mouth, and Caleb Farrow, the farm boy who climbed through a princess's window, looked into the abyss that loved him and waited for the darkness to descend. Epilogue. They found what was left of him 3 months later. The Farrow boy. No, the Bridger's son-in-law, sitting in a chair by a dead fire. His body was untouched, not a mark on him. But his eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his face was frozen in an expression that made the men who found him cross themselves. He was smiling. Serafina wept beautifully at the funeral, wore black for the appropriate period, accepted condolences with grace. And at night, when the hollow slept, she walked the ridges hunting, feeding, growing stronger. The disappearances continued. A drifter here, a sinner there. The town learned not to ask questions. Judge Bridger died in his bed, and some said his final expression matched his son-in-law's. The mansion passed to Serafina, and she lived there alone, ageless and unchanging, for longer than anyone could remember. They still call her the Appalachian Princess. They still tell stories about the farm boy who loved her, who freed her, who became the first feast of her endless reign. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the wind blows cold through the hollers, you can still hear her hunting. She's still out there, watching, waiting. And she's always hungry. Beauty is a mask for the starving. Remember that if you ever see her smile. Story 5. The heat came off the blacktop in sheets that made the distance swim and writhe like something living. The man behind the wheel had not spoken in 40 miles and would not speak for 40 more, were it not for the figure that materialized at the roadside like some desert apparition, thumb raised against the white Nevada sky. He pulled the sedan onto the shoulder, and the gravel popped beneath the tires like small bones breaking. The hitchhiker was young, late 20s perhaps, with a canvas rucksack slung over one shoulder, and an easy smile that seemed wrong for this country, where nothing smiled and nothing grew. The young man opened the door and slid into the passenger's seat, and before he could speak, the smell hit him. Something chemical and sharp beneath the blast of the air conditioning, antiseptic but not quite, like a butcher's shop scrubbed down with bleach. He glanced at the driver, at the white-knuckled hands fixed to the wheel, and then at the back seat, where a large cooler sat wrapped in silver duct tape. The tape had been applied in frantic overlapping strips, wound around and around as if the container might burst open of its own volition. The young man introduced himself as Colton Sheehy and extended his hand across the console. The driver did not take it, did not look at it. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, though the car had not yet moved. Colton withdrew his hand and studied the driver, a man perhaps 50 years of age, though the years had been unkind and could have been more or fewer. His face was the color of old paper and slick with perspiration that had nothing to do with the heat. The air conditioning blew cold enough to raise gooseflesh on Colton's arms, yet the man was sweating through his shirt. Dark crescents spreading beneath his arms, a wet patch forming between his shoulder blades. The driver pulled back onto the highway, and the speedometer climbed past 80, past 90. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Not at the road behind them, at the cooler. From the back seat came a sound, faint, wet. The settling of ice, perhaps. Or perhaps something else, shifting in its container, adjusting to the motion of the car. Colton found himself straining to hear it again. That small, liquid noise, and when it came a second time, his skin prickled in a way he could not explain. He had hitched rides before in his year of wandering. Truckers, mostly. Sometimes families on vacation. Once a woman driving to her mother's funeral, who had cried for 200 miles, while Colton sat in silence and handed her tissues from the glove compartment. He had learned to read people quickly, to sense danger before it announced itself. The driver beside him now radiated something he had never encountered before. Not malice, something worse. Desperation so profound it had become its own kind of madness. The sedan devoured the miles, and the sun tracked westward, and the silence between them grew thick as something solid. Outside the window, the desert stretched to the mountains, brown and red and utterly empty, a land that had never learned to forgive. Colton had grown up in farm country in Iowa, had thought he understood emptiness, but this was different. This was emptiness that wanted to swallow you whole. He mentioned he was in the medical field himself, veterinary school, taking a year off to see the country, before he went back to memorize the names of bones and the life cycles of parasites. His professors had called it a leave of absence. His father had called it running away. Colton had not yet decided which of them was right. The driver made a sound in his throat that might have been acknowledgement. When Colton asked where they were headed, the man said only one word: Reno. When Colton asked what was in Reno, the driver's jaw worked silently for a long moment, the muscles bunching and releasing beneath the stubbled skin. Hospital, he said finally. The word hung in the air between them. Colton waited for more, but nothing more came. They passed a mile marker and then another. The highway stretched before them like a gray ribbon laid across the corpse of the earth. No other cars, no buildings, no signs of life save for the occasional vulture riding the thermals in lazy circles, patient as death itself. The driver's eyes went again to the rearview mirror. This time he was not looking at the cooler. He was looking at the empty road behind them, scanning it, searching for something that was not there. Or something that was. They said they'd be watching, he muttered. His voice was dry as the desert outside. Said if I stopped, the deal was off. Who said that? But the driver did not answer. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator and the engine whined in protest, and the speedometer needle crept toward 100. Colton pulled his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. No signal. He tried to send a text anyway, watched the little circle spin and spin, going nowhere. The driver saw this and something shifted in his face. Some new tension layering atop all the others. Won't work out here. Nothing works out here. The smell from the back seat had grown stronger. Or perhaps Colton was simply more aware of it now, that wrongness beneath the chemical mask. It reminded him of the anatomy lab in his first year, that particular smell of flesh held at the edge of decay, the careful balance of preservation that kept tissue viable for study. But this was different. Sweeter somehow. More urgent. Like fruit beginning to turn, that moment just before rot, when sweetness becomes something else entirely. The cooler sloshed again. The sound was louder now, more insistent, as if something inside were moving of its own accord. Colton knew it was only the motion of the car, the simple physics of liquid responding to acceleration and turn. But he could not stop himself from glancing back at it, at the silver tape wound tight as a bandage around a wound, at the white plastic corners visible beneath. He thought about what could be in there. Medical supplies, the man had said when Colton asked. But medical supplies did not need to be kept this cold. Medical supplies did not slosh. Medical supplies did not fill a car with the smell of a slaughterhouse trying to pass as a surgery. The driver's breathing had changed. Shallow, quick. His tongue darted out to wet his lips and found them dry. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality of a man talking in his sleep, words tumbling out without permission. Just need to get there, before it goes bad, before the ice melts. Got to keep it fresh. Got to keep it cold. Colton tested the door handle, locked. The child safety engaged from the driver's side. He felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice steady the way he had learned to keep it steady when working with frightened animals in the clinic. Calm in the voice, even when calm had fled from everywhere else. Pull over. Let me out. Can't stop. No time. They're watching. Nobody's watching. The road is empty. The driver laughed. It was an awful sound, hollow and wet, the laugh of a man who had forgotten what laughter was for. They're always watching. That's what they said. They know where I am. They know if I stop. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. The sound made Colton jump, made the driver's hands jerk on the wheel. The car swerved toward the center line and back again, tires screaming against the asphalt. The driver grabbed the phone. Read the message. His face went paler still, though Colton would not have thought that possible. The screen glowed in the dim interior of the car, pale blue light washing over features that had gone slack with something beyond fear. Almost there? The driver's eyes met Colton's for the first time. Really met them, not the flickering sideways glances of before, but a direct gaze that seemed to see through him to something beyond. In those eyes, Colton saw something he had never seen before and hoped never to see again. He saw the particular madness of a man who has bargained with devils and is only now beginning to understand the terms. The driver reached beneath his seat and produced a knife. Not large, not theatrical. A simple folding knife, the kind a man might use to cut fishing line or open packages. He held it loosely, almost carelessly, the blade catching the light that streamed through the windshield. I need you to help me with this. Colton pressed himself against the passenger door. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged thing seeking escape. He thought about the locked doors, the empty desert, the knife in the man's hand. He thought about his mother in Iowa who did not know where he was, his father who had stopped asking, his professors who expected him back in the fall for a life he was no longer certain he wanted. "I can't do it alone," the driver said. His voice cracked on the words. "I've been driving for 12 hours and I can't feel my hands anymore. And you said you were medical. You said you knew about—" His voice broke. The word he could not say hung between them like a held breath. The knife. The cooler. The desperate flight across the desert toward a hospital in Reno. Colton understood then what cargo they carried, what desperate errand drove this broken man to madness. The understanding came not as a revelation, but as a settling, pieces falling into place with a terrible inevitability. "Whose?" he whispered. The driver sobbed, a single sharp sound that seemed to tear itself from his chest. "My boys." The car had slowed, not stopped, but slowed, the speedometer dropping to a merely reckless 80 miles per hour. The knife lay on the dashboard where the driver had set it down, forgotten now, irrelevant to everything that mattered. Colton listened. The man's name was Grady Phelan. He was 52 years old and had worked as a pipe fitter in Sacramento for 28 years. He spoke these facts in a flat voice, the voice of a man reciting statistics about someone else's life. And perhaps that was what it felt like to him now. Perhaps the man who had lived that life was already gone, replaced by this hollow thing behind the wheel. He had buried his wife 3 winters past. Breast cancer, diagnosed too late, treated too little. Her name was June, and she had freckles across her nose that she hated, and he loved, and she had made the best apple pie in the county, and she had died in a hospital bed in Sacramento, with her husband holding one hand and her son holding the other. The son, Everett, 19 years old. The boy had held his mother's hand as she died, and had not cried until later, until he was alone in his car in the hospital parking garage, and Grady had found him there by accident, had heard the sobs through the window, and had climbed into the back seat and held his son the way he had held him when he was small, when nightmares could be cured with presence alone. 6 months after the funeral, the boy's heart began to fail. Dilated cardiomyopathy. Grady said the words carefully, the way a man might handle something fragile and dangerous. The doctors had explained it to him, had drawn diagrams and used terms he did not understand. The heart muscle weakening, the chambers stretching like a balloon blown too full, the pump losing its prime, failing by degrees, counting down toward a silence that could not be reversed. They had put Everett on the transplant list and told Grady to wait. 6 months now. 6 months of watching his son grow weaker, watching the monitors track the slow decline, watching the hope drain from the boy's eyes a little more each day. They said he wasn't high enough priority, said there were others ahead of him, others whose hearts were failing faster, as if this were a race and the prize went to whoever was closest to death. The underground market had found him. That was how Grady described it, as if he had been passive in the transaction, as if the choice had been made for him by forces beyond his control. But Colton heard the truth beneath the words. A desperate man searching the dark corners of the internet at 3 a.m, messages sent to strangers, phone calls made to numbers that should never have been dialed. A contact in Sacramento who knew a contact in Vegas who knew a man who could procure what the hospitals could not provide. $200,000. Everything Grady Phelan had. The house his wife had died in, mortgaged to the foundation and then sold outright. The truck he'd driven for 15 years. His 401k, cashed out with penalties he did not care about. The life insurance money from June's death, money he had sworn on her grave he would save for their son's future. All of it converted to cash and handed over in a parking garage in Oakland to a man whose face Grady could no longer remember clearly, though only 3 days had passed. A man who had smiled and shaken his hand and promised that everything was going to be all right. They had called yesterday, told him where to go, what to do. A motel outside of Tonopah where a cooler would be waiting in a room registered under a name that was not his own. Instructions to drive straight through, no stops, get it back to Sacramento where a surgeon had been paid to meet him, to perform the transplant in a private surgical suite outside the hospital system. They had arranged everything, they said. His son would be transported from the hospital to the surgical facility. All Grady had to do was deliver the heart. 24 hours, they had told him. Maybe 30 if he kept it cold enough. After that, the organ would be useless. He was already at 22 hours. The smell from the cooler seemed to pulse in the enclosed space of the car. Colton's eyes watered from it, that sweet-rot wrongness beneath the chemical veil. He thought about what he knew of organ transport, the narrow window of viability, the precise conditions required to keep tissue alive outside the body. Something about this smell did not fit the careful protocols he had studied. Something about it whispered of failure already arrived. "Let me look at it," Colton said. Grady's foot eased off the accelerator. The car drifted toward the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires. "I need to check the ice. Make sure it's still viable. I have training." It was not entirely a lie. He had spent 2 years in veterinary school before his leave of absence. Before the night his fiancée had told him she was leaving, before the apartment had become too empty and the future had become too certain, and he had packed a bag and started walking west. He had dissected hearts in the laboratory, had learned the chambers and the valves, had held in his hands the organs of pigs and dogs, and once, in a special seminar, a human cadaver. He knew enough to recognize what he was looking at. He knew enough to know if something was wrong. Grady pulled the car onto the shoulder and killed the engine. The silence that followed was immense, the desert holding its breath around them. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant cry of a hawk hunting the thermals, and beneath that, from the back seat, a faint, wet sound, like something breathing that should not breathe. Colton stepped out of the car. The heat struck him like a physical blow, the air so hot it seemed to sear his lungs. He had thought the car was cold, but the cold had been artificial, mechanical, a thin barrier against the truth of this place. The truth was fire. The truth was a land that wanted you dead and would wait as long as it took. He opened the rear door and the smell rolled out to meet him, thick and wrong and inescapable now. Not the clean chemical scent of proper medical preservation, something older, something that had already begun to turn. He looked at the cooler, at the desperate wrapping of duct tape, at the hope and horror contained within. He began to cut the tape. The container inside was medical grade, white plastic with a biohazard symbol on the lid, the kind used for transporting organs between hospitals. Colton had seen containers like this in his training, had watched videos of transplant teams rushing them through hospital corridors, had studied the protocols that kept their contents viable. This one looked right, official, convincing. But the ice had grown gray and soft, half melted, the water pooling at the bottom, tinged with something that was not quite pink. And when Colton lifted the lid, the smell hit him, full in the face. His gorge rose and he swallowed hard against it, breathing through his mouth. The preservation solution was cloudy, muddied, small dark threads swirling in the fluid like ink dispersing in water. The careful chemistry of organ preservation had failed somewhere, or had never been right to begin with. And floating in that murk, a heart. Colton had seen hearts before, in jars of formaldehyde, yellowed and strange, in the open chests casts of laboratory animals, still and silent, and somehow less real than they should have been, in the glossy pages of textbooks, diagrammed and labeled and reduced to their component parts. But there was something wrong with this one. Something he felt before he understood. The color was off, too dark in places where it should have been pale, too pale in others where blood should have pooled. The texture of the tissue seemed strange, puckered in ways that spoke of stress or damage or preservation gone wrong. The surface that should have been smooth was rough, almost fibrous, as if the organ had aged decades in the span of hours. He reached in with careful hands and lifted it from its bath. It was heavier than he expected, cold and slick and somehow more real than anything he had ever touched. The realness was overwhelming, almost nauseating. This had been inside someone. This had beaten. This had pushed blood through vessels and kept someone alive, breath after breath, year after year, until it had stopped. But the realness was also wrong. The weight was wrong. The way it sat in his palms was wrong. These were not the proportions he remembered from his studies, not the architecture he had memorized in late-night cramming sessions before practical exams. Grady had gotten out of the car and stood watching, his face a mask of desperate hope. His lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps simply in the repetition of promises he had made to his son. The sun beat down on them both, and the desert wind stirred the dust at their feet, and the vultures circled overhead, patient, waiting for something to die. Colton turned the heart over in his hands. He examined the chambers, the great vessels, the outer surface that should have been smooth pericardium, but was not, was rough in places, textured in ways he had seen before, but never in a human specimen. The smell rose from it, rich and wrong, the smell of meat beginning to spoil. The aortic root was too small. He stared at it, willing himself to be wrong, willing the proportions to shift, the anatomy to rearrange itself into something that made sense. But the aortic root was too small, and the pulmonary veins entered at the wrong angle, and the coronary arteries followed a pattern he had seen before, many times, in the anatomy lab where they practiced on animal specimens before moving to human cadavers. He could lie. The thought came to him clearly, coldly, with the precision of pure survival instinct. He could say it looks fine. He could say, get back in the car. You're almost there. It's going to be okay. He could say whatever this broken man needed to hear to let Colton out of this desert, away from this knife and this madness and this cargo that smelled of death and failure. Grady would drive on to Reno, would walk into that hospital with his cooler and his hope and his $200,000 worth of faith in strangers. The surgeon would open the container and examine its contents, and the truth would emerge in that sterile room, surrounded by professionals who would not know what to say, far from the son who was waiting for salvation that would never come. And Colton would be somewhere else by then, somewhere far away. He could hitch another ride, continue his wandering, pretend this had never happened. He could add this to the list of things he was running from, the growing catalog of moments he had chosen not to face. He looked at Grady, at the red-rimmed eyes and the trembling hands and the face that had aged a decade in the past 2 days, at the hope that flickered there like a candle flame in a hurricane, fragile and desperate, and so terribly easy to preserve with a single, simple lie. He thought about Everett, 19 years old, lying in a hospital bed in Sacramento, waiting for his father to return, waiting for the miracle that would save him, waiting with the particular patience of the dying, who have learned that time moves differently when you have so little of it left. He thought about what it would mean for that boy to die without his father there, to die waiting for a man who was chasing a lie across the desert, who would arrive too late with nothing but a rotten piece of meat and a broken heart. How much did you pay for this? Grady blinked. The question seemed to confuse him, seemed irrelevant to the matter at hand. Everything. Everything I had. Colton looked down at the heart in his hands. $30 at a butcher's shop, he thought. Maybe 40. A pig's heart, bought wholesale from a restaurant supply company or a slaughterhouse, packed in ice and dressed up in medical packaging and sold as salvation to a man who would have paid anything, believed anything, done anything to save his son. Grady was still watching him, still waiting. The hope in his eyes was unbearable, and Colton understood that he was about to destroy it, that the words he was going to say would break something in this man that could never be repaired. I'm sorry. The words fell between them like stones into still water. Grady's face did not change at first, did not move. He stood there in the desert sun and waited for what came next, as if some part of him had always known this moment was coming, had been waiting for it since the first phone call, the first promise, the first payment made in a parking garage to men whose faces he could no longer remember. Colton held up the heart, this worthless thing, this cruel joke, this piece of meat that had cost a man everything he had ever earned or saved or loved. This isn't human. Grady stared at him. The words did not seem to register. It's porcine. From a pig. The chambers are wrong. The vessels are wrong. Everything is wrong. It was never going to work. It couldn't have worked. The hope in Grady's eyes flickered, guttered, went out. He did not scream, did not rage, did not fall to his knees or beat his fists against the uncaring earth. He simply stood there, a man hollowed out from within, emptied of everything that had kept him upright and moving and alive. The desert wind blew and the dust stirred and the vultures circled, and Grady Phelan became something less than he had been, something broken in a way that could never be fixed. "My boy," he whispered. The words were not meant for Colton, were not meant for anyone. They were the last sounds a man made before he became something else, a shell with nothing left inside it. A body that would go on breathing and walking and speaking, but would never again contain whatever had made it human. Colton lowered the heart back into its bath of clouded fluid, closed the lid, stood there in the heat with his hands at his sides, slick with preservation solution and something else, something that smelled of rot and failure, and no words left to say. They drove on the way they had been heading, west now, continuing toward Sacramento, toward the hospital where a boy named Everett Phelan lay dying. But the purpose had changed. There would be no surgeon waiting, no private surgical suite, no transplant. Only a father returning to hold his son's hand while time ran out. Grady drove slowly, carefully. A man in no hurry to arrive at a destination he could not bear to reach. The cooler sat in the back seat. Neither of them had suggested removing it. Neither had wanted to touch it again. It sat there like a third passenger, silent and present. A monument to everything that had gone wrong. The sun sank toward the mountains and the shadows lengthened and the desert turned from brown to gold to red, colors bleeding across the landscape like a wound. Colton watched the light change and thought about the men who had done this. They were out there somewhere, counting their money, planning their next job, sleeping soundly in beds paid for by the desperation of fathers and mothers who would do anything, pay anything, believe anything to save their children. Grady's phone buzzed once more as they crossed back into California. He did not look at it, did not reach for it. The screen lit up the dim interior of the car with its pale glow and then went dark again, the message unread, the sender unknown and uncaring, already moving on to the next mark, the next desperate voice on the phone, the next $200,000 waiting to be harvested from someone's hope. As the first stars appeared, Grady began to speak. He talked about June, how they had met at a county fair when they were both 17, two kids from farming families who had never been more than 50 miles from home. She had beaten him at the ring toss, 3 rings to his none, and had laughed at the look on his face and had let him buy her a lemonade to soothe his wounded pride. He had fallen in love with her right there, watching her choose a stuffed bear from the prize wall, a ridiculous purple thing that she kept on their bed for 30 years until the day she died. He talked about the early years, the apartment above the hardware store where they had lived when they were first married, so small you could stand in the middle and touch both walls. The jobs he had worked, 3 at a time some months, pipe fitting and construction, and a graveyard shift at a warehouse, anything to keep them afloat while she finished her nursing degree. The way she had cried when she got her first paycheck, not because of the money, but because it meant they had made it. They had survived the hard years. They were going to be all right. He talked about Everett's birth, how June had been in labor for 18 hours and had never once complained, never once asked for anything except ice chips and her husband's hand, how the boy had come into the world screaming, furious at being evicted from the only home he had ever known, and how he had stopped crying the moment Grady held him, had looked up at his father with eyes that seemed to see everything, to understand everything, to forgive everything in advance. He talked about the Little League games and the science fairs and the go-kart Everett had built from spare parts when he was 12, a rickety death trap that somehow never killed anyone. He talked about the college applications and the scholarships and the future that had seemed so bright, so certain, so full of possibilities that Grady could not have imagined running out. He talked about the diagnosis. The word cancer delivered like a weather report. June squeezing his hand. "We'll get through this." She had been wrong, but had never stopped believing she was right, not even at the end when the morphine made her see things that weren't there and call out for her mother, who had been dead for 20 years. He talked about the funeral, the rain that had fallen all day, as if the sky itself were grieving. Everett standing beside the grave in a suit that was too big for him, a suit they had bought for his high school graduation and that he had somehow shrunk inside of, his shoulders narrower, his frame smaller, as if grief were consuming him from within. And he talked about the night, 6 months later, when Everett had collapsed in the kitchen and Grady had found him on the floor, gasping, his face gray, his lips blue, his heart failing in his chest like an engine running out of fuel. The stars multiplied. The highway stretched on. The miles passed in silence, broken only by the voice of a father saying goodbye to his son, in the only way he knew how, telling the story of a life while there was still someone to tell it to. Colton listened. It was all he could do, all anyone could do. Some griefs were too large for comfort, too heavy for words. Some griefs could only be witnessed, only be held in the silence of presence, only be honored by the simple act of not looking away. When they reached Sacramento, it was well past midnight. The hospital rose before them, lit from within, a fortress against the darkness that surrounded it. Grady pulled into the parking garage and killed the engine, and sat there with his hands on the wheel, unable to move. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a pallid glow that made the shadows deeper and the silence louder. Somewhere above them, in a room neither of them could see, a boy was dying. A boy who had held his mother's hand as she passed, and who was now waiting for his father to return, waiting for news that would never come, waiting with the terrible patience of someone who has already begun to let go. Colton looked at the man beside him, at the exhausted face, the empty eyes, the hands that had finally stopped trembling because there was nothing left to tremble for. He thought about all the things he could say, all the empty comforts and hollow reassurances that people offered in moments like this, words that meant nothing and helped no one, but that filled the silence because silence was unbearable. He said none of them. You go up there. You sit with him. You hold his hand. Grady closed his eyes. A single tear escaped, running down his cheek to lose itself in the stubble of his jaw. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I promised him. I promised I'd save him. You did everything you could. It wasn't enough. No, it wasn't. The words hung between them. Colton had not meant to say them, had not meant to speak the truth so baldly, but there it was. The truth that no one wanted to hear. The truth that helped nothing and healed nothing, but that was true nonetheless. Grady opened his eyes, looked at Colton. Something passed between them, some understanding that went beyond words, an acknowledgement of the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. A recognition that some things could not be fixed, could not be saved, could only be endured. He opened the door, stepped out. Stood there in the harsh light of the parking garage, a man at the end of everything. Colton got out too, retrieved his rucksack from the floorboard, walked around the car to stand beside this stranger he would never see again. There was nothing to say, no words that could make this better. So Colton simply held out his hand, and this time, Grady took it. They stood there for a moment, clasped together, two men in a parking garage in the small hours of the morning. Above them, the hospital hummed with its endless work. The business of living and dying that went on whether anyone was ready for it or not. Below them, the city slept, dreaming whatever dreams cities dream. Then Grady let go, turned, walked toward the elevator. Colton watched him go, watched the doors close, watched the numbers climb floor by floor toward whatever waited above. He stood there for a long time after Grady had gone. Then he shouldered his pack and walked out of the garage and into the night. The boy died at 7:43 in the morning. Grady was holding his hand when it happened. Had been holding it for hours, watching the monitors track the slow decline, listening to the machines breathe for his son, while his son could no longer breathe for himself. The nurses came and went, and the doctors checked their charts, and the night gave way to dawn, and still Grady sat there, holding on, unable to let go. Everett had not woken up, had not spoken, had not opened his eyes to see his father sitting beside him, to hear whatever words Grady might have found to say. He had simply slipped away, his grip loosening, his chest falling still, the machines screaming their alarms into a room that had gone suddenly terribly quiet. The doctors tried what they could try and failed, as they were always going to fail. Grady stood in the corner and watched them work and did not interfere, did not cry out, did not beg them to try harder. He knew, had known since the desert, since the moment he had seen the truth in Colton's eyes. His son was already gone, had been gone, perhaps, since the moment his heart had first begun to fail, since the moment the universe had decided that this boy would not live, that this father would not save him, that all the money and desperation and hope in the world could not buy a single extra heartbeat. When it was over, when the doctors had stepped back and the nurses had disconnected the machines and someone had pulled the sheet up over Everett's face, Grady walked to the bed. He stood there looking down at the shape beneath the white cotton, this thing that had been his son and was now only a body, only meat, only matter beginning its long, slow return to the earth. He reached out and touched the sheet where Everett's hand would be, the hand he had held when the boy was born, the hand he had held when June died, the hand he had held through the long night just ended, waiting for a miracle that would never come. "Thank you," Everett had said to him before he left for the desert. sitting up in his hospital bed, pale and thin and already half a ghost. Thank you for trying. Grady had kissed his son's forehead and promised him that everything was going to be all right. Had walked out of the hospital and driven to a parking garage in Oakland and handed over everything he had to men whose faces he could no longer remember. Had driven through the night and across the desert and back again, chasing a hope that had never been real, believing in a lie because the alternative was unthinkable. Now the alternative was all that remained. He stood there for a long time. The sun rose higher and the room grew bright, and the hospital went on with its endless work around him, the living tending to the dying becoming the dead. Someone would come soon to ask him about arrangements, about next of kin, about all the paperwork that death required. Someone would ask him to sign forms and make decisions and pretend that any of it mattered. But for now, for these few moments, he was alone with his son, with what had been his son. With the silence that had replaced the heartbeat, he had crossed a desert to save. In a motel room in Las Vegas, 400 miles to the south, a man sat on the edge of a bed and counted bills into neat stacks. $200,000, more money than he had ever held at once. The bills were crisp and clean, hundreds mostly, bound with the rubber bands that left small indentations in his fingers. He counted them twice, then a third time, not because he distrusted the amount, but because he enjoyed the feel of them, the weight of them, the simple, tangible reality of wealth in his hands. His name was not important. He had many names, used different ones for different jobs, kept none of them for long. What mattered was the money. What mattered was the system, perfected over years of practice, that allowed him to extract it from people who could not afford to lose it, but who would pay anyway, because what choice did they have? When your child was dying, you did not comparison shop. You did not ask for references. You handed over everything you had, and you prayed to whatever God would listen, and you drove through the desert with a cooler full of pig organs and hope. He thought about the father. Grady, his name had been. A pipe fitter from Sacramento with a dying son and a dead wife, and a desperation so pure it was almost beautiful. The man had wept when he handed over the money, had thanked him, had shaken his hand and looked at him with eyes full of gratitude, as if he were a savior rather than a thief. The pig heart had cost $43 from a restaurant supply company that sold to high-end steakhouses. The medical cooler had been purchased online for $60. The biohazard stickers and preservation solution had added another $20. Total investment, under $150. Return, $200,000. He finished counting. Bound the stacks with rubber bands, placed them in a duffel bag, and zipped it closed. The phone on the nightstand held 3 other conversations in progress. 3 other fathers, 3 other mothers, 3 other desperate souls who had found his number through channels they did not fully understand and who were now in various stages of the dance. One was still negotiating price. One had agreed to terms and was liquidating assets. One was scheduled to pick up a cooler tomorrow night from a motel in Flagstaff. He set the phone aside, made a mental note to pick up a new burner tomorrow. The coverage on this one was getting spotty, and he'd almost missed a call last week. Nearly cost him a deal in Tucson. Couldn't have that. He turned off the lamp, lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, where the light from the Las Vegas Strip painted shifting patterns through the curtains. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since breakfast. There was a steakhouse downstairs, a good one, and he thought he might treat himself tomorrow. Celebrate a little. The filet there was excellent, pink in the center, butter melting into the meat. He wondered idly if they sourced their beef from the same supplier he used for the hearts. Probably not. Different cuts, different markets. In a few hours, he would drive to Phoenix, Meet with a contact about a new source of medical packaging, higher quality, more convincing. He needed to get his oil changed first. The sedan was overdue and he couldn't afford a breakdown. Not with the Flagstaff job coming up. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowed, and he slept the deep and dreamless sleep of a man with no conscience to trouble him. No ghosts to haunt his rest. No sense that the world owed anything to anyone, or that suffering had meaning, or that the arc of the universe bent toward anything at all. Outside the window, the Las Vegas sun climbed higher, blazing down on a city built on the certainty that there would always be another Mark, another desperate soul, another heart willing to break itself open and pour out everything it had for the chance, however slim, however false, of one more day with the people it loved. In Sacramento, in a parking garage beneath a hospital where a 19-year-old boy had just stopped breathing, a sedan sat where it had been left in the small hours of the morning. The keys were still in the ignition. The doors were unlocked. In the back seat, the cooler sat in a shaft of light that fell through the concrete pillars, dust motes swirling in the air above it like something trying to escape. The ice had finished melting hours ago. The preservation solution had grown warm, then warmer still, the careful chemistry of organ transport giving way to the simpler chemistry of decay. Inside the white plastic container with its biohazard symbol and its official-looking seals, the pig's heart had begun to rot. By noon, it would be gray and soft, the tissue breaking down, the cells rupturing, the structure that had once pumped blood through a living body, dissolving into something formless and foul. By evening, it would be unrecognizable, just meat, just waste, just $43 worth of restaurant supply returning to the entropy from which it had briefly been borrowed. No one would find it for 3 days. A security guard would notice the smell first, would follow it to the abandoned sedan, would call the police, who would call a hazmat team who would open the cooler, expecting to find something terrible, and finding only this, a rotted piece of meat in a bath of spoiled fluid. A mystery that would never be solved, a story that would never be told. They would tow the car and impound it, and eventually auction it off, and the new owner would never know what cargo it had carried, what desperate journey it had made, what hope had died in its back seat on a highway in the Nevada desert. The cooler would be incinerated with the rest of the medical waste, ash rising into the California sky, scattering on the wind, settling on the earth to be absorbed and forgotten. And in a hospital room 12 floors above, a father would be signing paperwork, authorizing the release of his son's body, listing the personal effects to be returned, answering questions about funeral arrangements and organ donation, and all the bureaucratic necessities that death required, the forms and signatures and checkboxes that reduced a human life to a series of administrative tasks. He would not mention the desert, would not mention the cooler, would not mention the $200,000 or the men who had taken it or the pig's heart that had cost him everything he had. What would be the point? Who would believe him? And even if they did, even if some investigation were launched, some search conducted, some justice pursued, it would not bring his son back, would not bring his wife back, would not undo any of the choices that had led him here, to this room, to this moment, to this silence that would follow him for the rest of his life. He signed the last form, handed it to the administrator, walked out of the hospital into the California morning, where the sun was shining and the birds were singing, and the world was going on as it always went on, indifferent to the small tragedies that played out upon its surface. He had no home to return to, no savings, no future. He had traded everything for a chance to save his son, and the chance had been a lie, and now his son was dead, and he was alone in a world that did not care, had never cared, would never care. He stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital and watched the traffic pass and the people hurry by on their way to jobs and appointments and lives that still had meaning. He thought about Colton, the young man who had told him the truth in the desert, who had ridden with him through the night, who had held his hand in the parking garage and then walked away into the darkness. He wondered where Colton was now, whether he had found another ride, whether he had continued his wandering or turned back toward whatever he had been running from. He thought about June, her freckles, her laugh, the way she had looked at him on their wedding day, as if he were the only man in the world, as if their future together were a gift she could hardly believe she had been given. He thought about Everett, the weight of him as an infant, the sound of his laugh as a child, the look in his eyes when Grady had promised him that everything was going to be all right, that he would find a way, that he would save him. Thank you for trying. Grady Fallon stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital where his son had died and wept. Not the quiet tears of the parking garage, not the silent grief of the long drive home, but great racking sobs that shook his whole body, that drew stares from passers-by, that announced to the world that something terrible had happened here, that a man had been broken in a way that could never be repaired. No one stopped. No one asked if he was all right. The people of Sacramento had their own lives, their own griefs, their own children to worry about. They walked around him as they would walk around any obstacle, any inconvenience, any reminder that the world was full of suffering and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The sun rose higher, the day grew warm, and eventually, because there was nothing else to do, Grady Phelan wiped his face and straightened his shoulders and began to walk. He did not know where he was going, did not know what he would do when he got there, did not know how he would survive the days and weeks and years that stretched before him, empty and purposeless and utterly alone. But he walked anyway, one foot in front of the other, forward because forward was the only direction left. And behind him, in the parking garage in the back seat of an abandoned sedan, a pig's heart continued its slow dissolution, rotting in the California heat, forgotten by everyone, mourned by no one, returning to the nothing from which it had come. The world did not notice. The world never did. Story 6. The room was white in the way that rooms are white when someone has decided that white is the absence of everything and therefore safe. Nora Ashby had come to understand this about white rooms. They were built by people who believed that emptiness could be a form of protection, that if you removed enough of the world would stop trying to get in. She sat on the edge of her bed. It was her bed. She had claimed it. She had rights to it. And watched the door. The door was also white, but it was not the same white as the walls. The walls were the white of surrender. The door was the white of waiting. Beyond the door, the creature moved. She could hear it sometimes, a soft displacement of air that meant it was standing just on the other side, breathing the way Mark used to breathe when he was thinking about something he didn't want to say. But the creature wasn't Mark. That was the thing she had to remember, the thing she wrote down in her notebook 17 times each morning so that she wouldn't forget. This is not your husband. This is not your husband. This is not your husband. The notebook was spiral-bound, the kind they sold at drugstores for 99 cents, and Nora had filled 3 of them already with her observations. She kept them under her mattress, which was thin enough that she could feel them when she slept, their spiral bindings pressing into her spine like a reminder. The creature had not found them yet. The creature did not know that she knew. She had developed a system for her observations, a code that only she could read. The letter T meant the creature had touched the door handle. She could see the slight depression when it did, the way the metal flexed. The letter V meant it had spoken, and she would record the exact words in quotation marks, analyzing them later for inconsistencies. The letter S meant it had left her something. Food, usually, or sometimes objects it claimed had meaning. She cataloged these offerings the way an anthropologist might catalog the artifacts of an alien civilization. Each one revealed something about the creature's methods, its goals, its terrible patience. Nora. The voice came through the door at 7:15, just as it always did. The creature was punctual. Mark had never been punctual. Mark had been the kind of man who arrived 20 minutes late to his own wedding, laughing, apologizing, already forgiven, because that was the thing about Mark. You couldn't stay angry at him. He had a face that had been designed for forgiveness. But the creature wearing Mark's face had learned punctuality, and this was how Nora knew it wasn't him. "Nora, I brought you something to eat. Dr. Feldman says you need to eat." She pressed her back against the headboard, her headboard in her room, and did not answer. In her notebook, she had recorded that the creature spoke of Dr. Feldman often, invoking the name like a talisman. Dr. Feldman says, Dr. Feldman thinks, Dr. Feldman believes. She had never met Dr. Feldman, or if she had, she couldn't remember it. There were gaps in her memory now, places where things had been removed like bad teeth, and she had learned not to probe them too deeply. Some absences were protection. "I'm going to leave the tray by the door, okay? It's just oatmeal. The kind with the little packets of brown sugar, the way you like it." The way she liked it. The creature had memorized her preferences with the precision of a scholar preparing for an examination. It knew that she took her coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of milk. It knew that she preferred the left side of the bed. It knew that she always slept with 1 foot outside the covers because she got too hot otherwise. It had cataloged her like a specimen, filed her away in its inhuman mind, and now it performed these small kindnesses like an actor running lines. Nora waited until she heard the footsteps recede, soft shuffling, hesitant, in a way that Mark's footsteps had never been, and then she crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. Nothing. The silence of something that had learned to be silent. She opened the door 3 inches, just enough to see the tray. The oatmeal steamed gently in its white bowl. The brown sugar packets were arranged in a neat row, 4 of them, because the creature had learned then that she liked 4. There was a small card propped against the bowl, and on it, in handwriting that looked like Mark's but wasn't too careful, too deliberate, each letter formed with the concentration of someone who had practiced, were the words, "Happy birthday, Mom." Mom. Nora closed the door and did not eat the oatmeal. She carried the card to her bed and studied it under the pale light from her window. The handwriting troubled her. It was close to Mark's, the same general slant, the same tendency to leave the tails of letters unfinished. But there was something mechanical about it, something that suggested reproduction rather than creation. She had seen Mark's handwriting thousands of times over 37 years. Grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like fruit, birthday cards with jokes that weren't funny but made her laugh anyway, the note he had left on her pillow the morning after their first fight that said, "Only I'm sorry. I love you. I'll do better." This wasn't that. This was a forgery, competent but soulless, like a painting made by someone who had studied technique but never understood beauty. She added the card to her collection under the mattress. Evidence. More evidence. The thing about the creature was that it had arrived gradually, the way all terrible things arrive. One morning she had woken up and Mark was standing at the foot of the bed holding a cup of coffee. And something was wrong with his eyes, not the color. The color was still that particular shade of gray-green that she had fallen in love with at a department store in Columbus when she was 22 and he had helped her reach a can of soup on a high shelf. Not the shape, not the way they sat in his skull, something deeper, something behind. Morning, sleepyhead, the thing with Mark's face had said, and she had taken the coffee and drunk it because what else was she supposed to do? You couldn't say to your husband of 37 years, "What have you done with my husband?" You couldn't say, "Where's the man I married and why are you wearing his skin?" But she had known. From that first morning, she had known. She had tried, at first, to catch it in its deceptions. She would ask questions about their past. "Do you remember what we had for dinner on our 5th anniversary? Do you remember what I said to you the night our son was born? Do you remember the name of the hotel in Michigan where we stayed on that trip when the car broke down?" And the creature would answer correctly every time, its stolen memories as precise as photographs. But there was something mechanical about the way it retrieved these memories, something that reminded Nora of a filing cabinet being opened and closed. Mark had never remembered anything correctly. Mark had thought their wedding anniversary was in April when it was in May. Mark had called their son by the dog's name at least twice a week for the first 3 years of the boy's life. The creature didn't make mistakes, and that was how she knew. There was a memory she kept returning to, though she wasn't sure anymore whether it was real or something she had constructed to fill one of the gaps. In the memory, she was in the kitchen of the house in Columbus. The yellow kitchen with the tile backsplash that Mark had installed himself badly, so that one row of tiles sat slightly higher than the others, and she was making dinner. Chicken with rosemary, Mark's favorite. Daniel was at the table doing homework. He was 12, maybe 13, his hair falling into his eyes, the way it always did, because he refused to let her cut it. He was working on a math problem, his pencil moving in short, frustrated strokes, and she could hear him muttering to himself, trying to work through something that wouldn't come clear. "Mom," he said finally, without looking up, "I don't get this." She had gone to him. She remembered that. She had stood behind him and looked at the problem. Something with fractions, she thought, though the numbers wouldn't come into focus when she tried to remember them. And she had explained it to him. She had always been good at math, better than Mark, who had never progressed past the kind of arithmetic you needed to balance a checkbook. And Daniel had listened, his pencil pausing, and then he had said, "Oh, I get it now." And he had looked up at her with an expression she couldn't name, something between gratitude and love, and the particular embarrassment of a boy who still needed his mother but didn't want to admit it. That was the memory. That was what she held on to when the white room became too white and the silence became too loud. But lately, she had begun to wonder, had it happened? Had any of it happened? Or had the creature planted these memories in her mind, false evidence of a life that had been manufactured to make her compliant? She couldn't tell anymore, and that was the most terrifying part. Her son. She tried not to think about her son. In the early days, before she had understood the full scope of the replacement, she had called him. His name was Daniel, and he had grown up to be something important, something with letters after his name. And she had been proud of him in the way that mothers are proud of sons who exceed expectations. He had been a difficult baby, colicky, inconsolable, screaming through the night until she and Mark took turns walking him in circles around the living room. Zombies in bathrobes, too exhausted to fight about whose turn it was. But he had grown into a sweet boy, and then a serious young man, and then a stranger who called on holidays and sent money when she asked for it, and never quite looked her in the eye. She had called Daniel to tell him about the creature. She had been careful, clinical, presenting the evidence she had gathered, the punctuality, the precision of memory, the wrongness behind the eyes. Daniel had listened without interrupting, which was something he had learned to do in his job, and when she was finished, he had said, "Mom, have you been taking your medication?" The medication. As if the medication were the answer to everything. As if you could swallow a pill and make the world go back to the way it had been before the creature came, before the accident, before... She tried not to think about the accident. The orderly who brought her evening medication was named Clyde. He was a large man with gentle hands, and he had been working on the ward for 15 years. Long enough to have seen Nora arrive, she realized, though she couldn't remember arriving. Long enough to have watched her decline. "Evening, Mrs. Ashby," he said, setting the small paper cup on her bedside table. "How are we feeling tonight?" She took the cup and looked at the pills inside. 2 white, 1 yellow, 1 that was half pink and half gray. She had memorized their shapes, their colors, the chemical names printed on bottles she had glimpsed when the nurses weren't paying attention. Olanzapine, sertraline, lorazepam. Words that sounded like incantations, spells meant to quiet the part of her brain that could see what others couldn't. "Fine," she said. Clyde waited while she put the pills in her mouth, lifted the water glass, swallowed. He waited while she opened her mouth to show him the pills were gone. This was the routine. This was how it worked. What Clyde didn't know was that Nora had learned to hold the pills under her tongue, pressed against her molars until he left. What he didn't know was that she had been spitting them into her mattress for 3 days now, saving them, though she wasn't sure yet what she was saving them for. "Dr. Ashby was asking about you again," Clyde said, lingering by the door. "He worries about you, you know, more than he probably should." "Dr. Ashby," the creature's professional name. Nora felt her face arrange itself into an expression of polite interest, the mask she had learned to wear when people spoke about things that didn't make sense. "He's a good man," Clyde continued. "I worked here a long time. Seen a lot of doctors come and go. Most of them. They do their jobs, sure, but they don't care, not really. It's just a paycheck to them. But Dr. Ashby," he shook his head, "that man would walk through fire for his patients. Especially for you." "Why especially for me?" Clyde looked at her strangely, as if she had asked why the sky was blue. "Because you're his mother, Mrs. Ashby. Because he loves you." After he left, Nora sat in the dark and listened to the silence and tried to make those words mean something. "Because you're his mother. Because he loves you." They were just sounds. They were just noise. They were evidence of nothing except how thoroughly the creature had infiltrated the world around her. How completely it had convinced everyone of its lie. There had been a car. There had been a road. There had been a moment when the road curved and the car did not, and after that, there had been a long period of whiteness, of rooms that were white, and faces that were white, and a kind of roaring silence that seemed to come from inside her own head. And when she had come out of the whiteness, Mark was different. The doctors said it was something called Capgras syndrome. They said it in gentle voices, the way you might explain to a child that the family dog had gone to live on a farm, and they told her that it was a result of the injury, that the part of her brain that recognized faces had become disconnected from the part that felt emotions, so that she could see her husband and know that he looked like her husband, but feel nothing, and the absence of feeling had been interpreted by her mind as wrongness, as replacement. But Nora knew the truth. She had always been able to see things that other people couldn't. When she was a child, she had known which days her father would come home drunk just by the way the light fell through the kitchen window. She had known that her mother's headaches meant that something bad was going to happen, and she had been right, hadn't she? She had been right about everything. The doctors didn't believe her, but that was fine. The doctors were probably in on it. The doctors probably worked for whoever, whatever, had sent the creature to replace her husband. 3 weeks after the creature first called her mom through the door, Nora had a visitor. She hadn't known she was allowed visitors. No one had told her the rules of this place, the boundaries that contained her existence. But that afternoon, an orderly she didn't recognize came to her door and said, "Mrs. Ashby, there's someone here to see you, a woman named Frances Polk. She says she's your sister." Frances. The name echoed in the white room, stirring something at the bottom of Nora's memory like sediment disturbed by a careless foot. Frances, who had taught her to ride a bicycle on the gravel driveway of their parents' house in Zanesville. Frances, who had cried at her wedding and told her she was making a mistake, though she had never explained what the mistake was. Frances, who had moved to Arizona 12 years ago and rarely called. And when she did call, the conversations were short and strange, full of pauses that neither of them knew how to fill. "Okay," Nora said, because she didn't know what else to say. They brought Frances to the common room, a beige space with plastic furniture and a television mounted too high on the wall, playing a talk show with the sound turned low. Frances looked older than Nora remembered, though Nora supposed she looked older too. Her sister's hair had gone gray, and her face had the weathered quality of someone who had spent too many years in the desert sun. "Nora," Frances said, and sat down across from her at one of the plastic tables. "God, it's been... How long has it been?" Nora didn't answer. She was studying her sister's face, looking for signs of replacement. But Frances's face was the same face it had always been. The same slightly crooked nose, the same faint scar above the left eyebrow from the time she'd walked into a doorframe as a child. If Frances had been replaced, the creature that had taken her form had done a flawless job. "I talked to your son," Frances said. "Daniel, he called me last month, told me how you were doing. He said..." She stopped. Her hands were folded on the table, the knuckles white. "He said you don't recognize him. He said you think he's some kind of imposter. He's not Daniel." "Nora, honey, he's Daniel. I was there when he was born, remember? I held him in the hospital. He spit up on my favorite blouse." Frances's laugh was thin, fragile. "He has Mark's eyes. He has your stubbornness. He's Daniel. You've been fooled. Everyone has been fooled." "By what? By who?" Frances leaned forward, and Nora could see the fear in her eyes. Fear and something else. Something that might have been grief. "What do you think happened, Nora? Do you think there's some kind of conspiracy? That someone replaced your son with a copy?" "I don't think anything, I know." Frances was quiet for a long moment. The television murmured in the background, a woman laughing about something that might have been funny. "Mark is dead," Frances said finally. "You know that, right? Mark died in the accident. I came to the funeral. You were still in the hospital. You couldn't come, but I was there. I watched them put him in the ground." Nora felt the words slide past her like water past a stone. Mark was dead. Mark had been replaced. These were two different sentences that people kept trying to make her believe meant the same thing. "I have to go," she said, and stood up, and walked back to her white room, and closed the door, and pressed her back against it, and breathed, and breathed, and breathed. Behind her, through the wood, she heard Frances crying. But Frances had probably been replaced too. Frances was probably just another creature, sent to reinforce the lie. Everyone was a creature now, everyone except her. The second notebook, the one she had filled in March, contained her theory of the replacement. She had written it in small, careful letters, aware that she was setting down knowledge that could be dangerous. The creature arrived on January 3rd. I know this because January 3rd was the day that Mark stopped leaving wet towels on the bathroom floor. He had left wet towels on the bathroom floor for 37 years. I had asked him to stop at least 10,000 times. And then on January 3rd, the towels were hanging neatly on the rack, and I knew. The creature is not from here. I don't know where it is from, but I know where it isn't. It isn't from this house because it doesn't know that the third step from the bottom creaks. It isn't from this marriage because it doesn't know that I hate it when someone touches my neck. It isn't from this life. What does it want? I think it wants to study me. I think I am being observed. I think that somewhere, in a place I cannot imagine, there are others like the creature, and they are watching through its eyes, learning how to be human, learning how to replace us one by one. I cannot let this happen. I cannot let them learn what they need to learn. I must stay vigilant. She had underlined the word vigilant 3 times. Nora, please open the door. It was evening now, or what passed for evening in the White Room. The creature had returned, and this time its voice was different. There was something ragged in it. Something that might have been emotion if the creature had been capable of emotion. I know today is hard. I know you miss him. I miss him too. Nora sat very still on the edge of her bed. The creature was trying something new. It had never spoken of Mark in the third person before. It had always maintained the pretense that it was Mark, that the replacement had been seamless, that no one could tell the difference. But now, 10 years, Mom. It's been 10 years today. And I thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe we could talk about it. About Dad. About the accident. The word accident made something shift in Nora's chest, a sensation like a drawer being opened that had been stuck for a long time. She pressed her hand against her sternum and breathed through it. Dr. Feldman says I shouldn't do this. He says I should maintain professional distance. But you're my mother, and it's been so long since you looked at me and actually saw me, and the creature's voice broke. Nora heard something that sounded like a sob being swallowed. I became a psychiatrist because of you. Did you know that? I wanted to understand what happened to you. I wanted to fix it. I thought if I studied hard enough, if I learned enough, I could bring you back. Stupid, right? Stupid and arrogant, and now you're here, in my hospital, in my ward, and I can't even... Nora reached under her mattress and pulled out the third notebook. She opened it to a fresh page and began to write. March 15th. The creature is attempting emotional manipulation. It has constructed an elaborate backstory designed to confuse me. It claims to be my son. It claims that Mark is dead. This is obviously false. I saw Mark this morning. He brought me oatmeal. She paused. Had Mark brought her oatmeal or had the creature? Sometimes the distinction blurred. Sometimes she couldn't remember which version of events was real and which was something she had dreamed or feared or hoped. I brought you a present, the creature said. Its voice was steadier now, as if it had collected itself. It's a photo album from before. I thought maybe if you saw the pictures, you might remember something. You might remember that I'm Daniel, that I'm your son. Nora did not open the door. She sat on her bed and listened to the silence that followed the creature's words. On the other side of the door, she could hear it breathing. Ragged, uneven breaths. The kind of breathing that came after crying. But creatures didn't cry, did they? Creatures didn't feel grief or love, or the terrible weight of being unrecognized by someone who should have known them better than anyone. Unless they had learned. Unless they had watched real humans cry and grieve and love, and had practiced until they could reproduce The sounds, the gestures, the wet shine in the eyes. The creature was clever. The creature had had 10 years to practice. After a long time, she heard footsteps moving away from her door, then softer, the sound of something sliding across the floor. The photo album, pushed through the gap at the bottom of the door. She didn't touch it, not yet. Not until she was sure the creature was gone. That night, she dreamed of the car. In the dream, she was driving. Mark was in the passenger seat, asleep. His head tilted against the window at an angle that would give him a crick in his neck when he woke up. The road was straight, and then it wasn't. The headlights illuminated a deer frozen in the classic posture of a deer about to die, and Nora turned the wheel, and the car went somewhere the road didn't, and then, in the dream, she was not in the car. She was standing on the side of the road, watching the car roll. It rolled 3 times, each revolution accompanied by the sound of breaking glass and bending metal, and when it came to rest, it was upside down, and she could see Mark's hand hanging out of the shattered window, limp, wrong, and she was running toward him. But the road kept getting longer, and she couldn't reach him, and she woke up with the word "no" stuck in her throat like a bone. The room was dark. The room was white. The room was a box that contained everything she had left, which was not much. On the ceiling, she could see a small red light blinking steadily. The camera that watched her sleep. Somewhere in a control room she had never seen, someone was monitoring her, recording her movements in the night. Or not someone. Something. The morning brought new certainties. Nora sat on her bed with her notebook and wrote, "The creature is escalating. It attempted emotional infiltration last night. It knows that I know what it is, and it is trying new tactics. It invoked a son that does not exist. It spoke of an accident, as if I were responsible. This is psychological warfare. I must not surrender. I have observed the creature's face through the window in my door. When it speaks, the muscles move correctly. The expressions are convincing. But there is a delay, a fraction of a second between the emotion it claims to feel and the expression it produces. This is because the creature must process the emotion, must calculate the appropriate response. A real human being feels and expresses simultaneously. The creature feels nothing and expresses everything. I asked it yesterday what my mother's maiden name was. It answered correctly, Brennan. But it pronounced it wrong. Mark always said Brennan. The creature said Brennan. This is because the creature learned the name from records, not from Mark's mouth. The creature is reading me, not remembering me. She closed the notebook. Her hands were shaking. They had been shaking more often lately, a fine tremor that made her handwriting harder to read. And the medication, probably. They gave her pills 3 times a day, pink and white and yellow, and she swallowed them because refusing the pills would mean they would watch her more closely, and she couldn't afford to be watched more closely. She needed space to think. She needed time to plan. The creature had made a mistake. It had mentioned the door. It had said something about breaking protocol to enter her room, and she had filed this information away, understanding without understanding that it meant the door could be opened from the outside, that the lock that kept her safe was not impenetrable, that the creature could come in if it wanted to, when it wanted to. She looked at her notebook and wrote, "I need to be ready." The woman who brought her lunch was named Deirdre, or so her name tag claimed. Nora didn't trust name tags. Name tags could be faked, printed in a back room somewhere by creatures who wanted to seem human. But Deirdre had kind eyes, really kind, not the calculated kindness of the creature, and she always left an extra packet of crackers on the tray. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" Deirdre asked as she set the tray on the small table by the window. The window was made of thick glass that didn't open, but you could see through it to a courtyard where other patients sometimes walked in circles, watched by attendants in white uniforms. "I'm fine," Nora said. This was what she always said. "Dr. Ashby was asking about you this morning." He seemed upset. "Dr. Ashby." The creature had a title now, a position. Nora made a mental note. The creature has infiltrated the medical establishment. It has credentials. It has access. "He's a good man, your son," Deidre said, not looking at Nora, straightening the napkin on the tray. "Works too hard, if you ask me. He's here every day, sometimes before sunrise. I tell him, 'Dr. Ashby, you need to take care of yourself, too.' But he doesn't listen. Reminds me of my own boy, actually. That same stubbornness. Your son." The words set in the air like a challenge. Nora kept her face neutral. The creature had clearly gotten to Deidre, had convinced her somehow, had woven its lies so thoroughly that even the woman with the kind eyes believed them. "He talks about you, you know," Deidre continued, adjusting the salt and pepper shakers that didn't need adjusting. "Not to me. I'm just an aide. He'd never... But I overhear things. In the break room, on the phone. He talks to people about experimental treatments, new medications, specialists in other states. Last week I heard him on the phone with someone in Switzerland." "Switzerland? Can you imagine? All that for one patient." "I'm not his patient," Nora said. "I'm his project." Deidre looked up, and for a moment something complicated crossed her face. "Sweetheart," she said, "you're his mother. You're the only family he has left. And he's been fighting for you every single day since you got here. I've seen a lot of families give up on people. A lot of husbands and wives and children who just stop coming. But not Dr. Ashby, not once. Not ever." She patted Nora's hand, a quick, furtive gesture, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed. And then she was gone. And Nora was alone with her tray of food and her window that didn't open and her certainties that were beginning, despite everything, to feel less certain. The photo album appeared under her door that afternoon. It was a thick album, the kind with sticky pages and plastic overlays that yellowed with age. Nora sat on her bed and stared at it for a long time before she touched it. The cover was dark blue, the kind of blue that fades in sunlight, and someone had written on it in silver marker, "The Ashby family." She opened it. The first page was a wedding photo. She recognized herself immediately. Younger, thinner, radiant in a way that she had forgotten she had ever been, standing next to a man in a gray suit. The man had gray-green eyes and a smile that suggested he had just told a joke, or was about to. Mark. This was Mark. Not the creature, but the real Mark, preserved in silver halide and memory. She turned the page. A baby in a hospital bassinet, red-faced and screaming. A young woman, herself, holding the baby, looking exhausted and terrified and proud. A man. Mark, standing beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other making a peace sign at the camera, written underneath in careful handwriting. Daniel Thomas Ashby, born September 15th, 1977, 7 pounds 4 ounces. She turned the page. The baby was older now, sitting in a high chair with spaghetti sauce smeared across his face. He was laughing at something outside the frame. The next photo, the same baby, a toddler now, standing on unsteady legs in a backyard that Nora recognized. Their backyard. The house in Columbus, the one they had lived in for 32 years before. She turned the page. She turned 20 pages. She watched the baby become a boy, become a teenager, become a young man. She saw graduation photos and birthday parties and Christmases. She saw Mark getting older, his hair graying, his waist thickening. She saw herself getting older, too, lines appearing around her eyes, her posture shifting. In every photo, there was a boy, a son, her son. She stopped on a photograph near the middle of the album. It showed a young man, 18, maybe 19, standing in front of a building she recognized. The building was red brick with white columns, and there was a sign that said, Ohio State University Medical Center. The young man was smiling, holding a folder, wearing a T-shirt that said, Class of 1999. She remembered this day, or she thought she did. She remembered driving Daniel to Columbus for his first day of medical school. She remembered how nervous he had been, how he had checked his bag 3 times to make sure he had everything. She remembered stopping at a diner on the way and ordering pancakes, and Daniel had eaten half of his and then pushed the plate away, too anxious to finish. What if I'm not smart enough, he had asked her, and she had reached across the table and taken his hand. You're smart enough, she had told him. You're the smartest person I know. You have to say that. You're my mom. I don't have to say anything. I'm telling you the truth. He had looked at her with those gray-green eyes, Mark's eyes, her dead husband's eyes. And for a moment she had seen the child he had been, the boy who caught fireflies and called them pieces of the sun. And then the moment had passed, and he was a young man again, a medical student, someone who was about to step into a future she couldn't follow him into. I love you, Mom, he had said. I love you too, baby. I'll always love you. In the photograph, the young man was still smiling. In the photograph, the day hadn't ended yet. In the photograph, everything was still possible. She closed the album. This was the trap. She understood that now. The creature had fabricated an entire history, had manufactured evidence of a life that had never happened, had created a son from whole cloth, and expected her to believe. But Nora was not foolish. Nora had read about this kind of thing. There were technologies now, ways of making photographs that had never been taken, memories that had never been lived. The creature was sophisticated. The creature had resources. She hid the album under her mattress with the notebooks. She would study it later, look for inconsistencies, find the seams in the illusion. There would be mistakes. There were always mistakes. And when she found them, she would have proof. That night she wrote, The creature has produced a document claiming to prove the existence of Daniel. The document appears to be a photo album spanning approximately 30 years. However, I note the following discrepancies. 1. The photographs have a uniform quality that suggests they were produced at the same time, not over decades. 2. My face in the photographs is subtly wrong. The smile is too practiced, the eyes too knowing. This is because the creature created these images from observation, not from life. 3. In one photograph, page 17, there is a birthday cake with the name Daniel on it. The handwriting on the cake does not match my handwriting. I did not write that name. She paused. Her hand was shaking badly now, and she couldn't remember if she had taken her evening medication. The pills were in a cup by her bed, but the cup was empty. Had she swallowed them without remembering? Did the creature know that the pills made her compliant, forgetful, easier to deceive? She added, I will not take the medication tomorrow. I need to be clear. I need to see. The days that followed were different. Without the medication, the world became sharper, more immediate. Colors were brighter. Sounds were louder. The creature's face, when it appeared in the window of her door, was more obviously wrong. The skin too smooth, the expressions too calculated, the eyes lacking the spark that she remembered in Mark's eyes, in the eyes of the son she might have had if the creature hadn't taken everything from her. Mom, please talk to me. The creature's voice was raw now, hoarse as if it had been crying, but the creature couldn't cry. Crying required emotion, required loss, required something to lose. The creature was performing grief the way an actor performs grief convincingly, but without the underlying truth. Dr. Feldman says I need to step back. He says I'm too close to this, that I'm making it worse. But how can I step back? You're my mother. You're all I have left. All it had left. Because it had consumed everything else, hadn't it? It had consumed Mark. It had consumed this Daniel that it kept invoking. It had consumed her life, her memories, her sanity. And now it wanted her to believe that she was the one who was lost. I brought you something else, the creature said. It was Dad's. His wedding ring. You gave it back to me after the funeral. You said you couldn't stand to look at it anymore. But I kept it. I've been keeping it for 10 years, waiting for a day when you might want it back. Nora heard something slide under the door. She did not move from her bed. I love you, Mom. I know you can't feel it right now. I know your brain is telling you things that aren't true. But I love you, and Dad loved you, and we had 37 years together, the three of us, and I won't let you forget that. I can't let you forget that. The creature's footsteps retreated. Nora waited until she was certain it was gone, and then she approached the door slowly, carefully, as if approaching a trap. On the floor lay a small velvet box, the kind that jewelry comes in. She opened it. Mark's wedding ring. Gold and simple, worn smooth in places from years of contact with skin. She held it up to the light and read the inscription on the inside of the band, N and M, May 12th, 1970. Her wedding date, her initials, and Mark's. She had given this ring to Daniel after the funeral. She remembered that now, or she thought she did. She remembered pressing it into his hand and saying, I can't look at it anymore. It hurts too much. And Daniel had taken it, had closed his fingers around it, had said, I'll keep it safe for you, Mom, until you're ready. Had that happened? Had she really said those words, felt that grief, passed that ring from her hand to his? She couldn't tell anymore. And that was the most terrifying part. She added the ring to her collection under the mattress. Evidence, she thought. More evidence. But evidence of what? The night before her birthday, Nora did not sleep. She sat on her bed with the ring in one hand and the photo album in the other, and she studied them both, looking for the lies, looking for the seams. The ring was worn smooth in places, the gold thinned by years of contact with skin. The photos were yellowed at the edges, the plastic overlays sticking slightly when she lifted them. Either the creature was impossibly thorough or... She closed her eyes and tried to remember. What was the last thing she remembered clearly? The road. The deer. The feeling of the steering wheel jerking in her hands, and then whiteness. A long white absence. And when she had emerged from the whiteness, Mark was different. But had Mark been there? In the hospital after the accident? Had there been a man beside her bed holding her hand, calling her name? She thought she remembered a hand, but she couldn't remember the face attached to it. She thought she remembered a voice, but it might have been the voice of a nurse or a doctor or someone else entirely. There was another memory. Half buried, refusing to surface fully. A room with machines, a face above her, young and frightened, saying something she couldn't hear. A hand holding hers, squeezing, letting go. And then the whiteness again, deeper than before. A whiteness that went on for what might have been days or weeks or years. When she had emerged from that whiteness, she was here, in the white room. And the creature had already begun its vigil outside her door. The creature said that Mark had died in the accident. The creature said that it was her son, that it had been visiting her for 10 years, that it had become a psychiatrist to help her. The doctors said that she had a syndrome, that her brain was damaged, that she saw imposters where there were only people who loved her. But what if she was wrong? The thought came unbidden, unwelcome, and she pushed it away. She could not afford doubt. Doubt was the first step toward surrender, and she had sworn she would never surrender. She had filled 3 notebooks with evidence. She had observed the creature for months. She knew what she had seen. Didn't she? She had been saving the scissors for 3 weeks. They were small scissors, the kind with rounded tips that they gave patients for supervised craft activities. Nora had palmed them during an art therapy session, slipping them into her sleeve while the orderly was helping another patient with her collage. The orderly hadn't noticed. No one ever noticed Nora anymore. She had become furniture, wallpaper, a fixture of the ward that required feeding and medicating, but not watching. The scissors weren't much. 4 inches of dull metal, the blades barely sharp enough to cut construction paper. But they were something. They were protection. And late at night, when the creature's footsteps passed her door, she would hold them under her blanket and feel their weight against her palm, and know that she was not entirely defenseless. She had sharpened them on the concrete windowsill, working slowly, patiently. Night after night, while the camera's red eye blinked its indifferent witness. The concrete was rough enough to give the blades an edge. Not razor sharp, but sharp enough. Sharp enough for what she needed. On the 4th night of sharpening, she had cut herself. The blade slipped, or her hand slipped, and suddenly there was blood. Her blood, red and real, dripping onto the white floor. She had watched it fall with a kind of fascination. This was proof, she thought. Proof that she was still human, still alive, still capable of being wounded. The creature could pretend to bleed, could simulate injury, but this blood was hers. This pain was hers. This was something they couldn't take from her. She had cleaned the blood with toilet paper and flushed it away, and she had been more careful after that. But she kept the memory of the cutting, the small, bright shock of it, stored alongside her other certainties. She could still feel. She could still hurt. She was still real. She hid the scissors under her mattress with the notebooks and the photo album and the ring. Her collection of evidence was growing. Soon, she thought. Soon she would have enough. Happy birthday, Mom. The creature's voice came through the door at exactly 8 o'clock, an hour earlier than usual. Nora was sitting on the edge of her bed. Her hands were hidden under the blanket, gripping the plastic handles of the scissors so tight her knuckles were white. She had been waiting. I asked Dr. Feldman for a special exception today. He said I could bring you breakfast in your room. Your favorite? French toast with strawberries, and I brought candles. 63 of them. I had to put them on a separate plate because they wouldn't all fit on the French toast. 63. She was 63 years old today. Or she would be if the creature's timeline was correct. If the creature's entire constructed history was correct. If anything was correct anymore. I'm going to come in now, okay? I have my key. I'm not supposed to use it. Dr. Feldman says it's a breach of protocol. But it's your birthday, and I want to give you a hug. I haven't hugged you in, God, I don't even know how long. Before the accident, probably. Before everything. Nora heard the sound of a key in the lock. Her hand tightened around the scissors under the blanket. I know you're scared, the creature said. I know you think I'm someone I'm not. But I need you to see me, Mom. Really see me. Just for 1 second, I need you to remember that I'm your son. That I love you. That I spent my entire adult life trying to find a way back to you. The lock clicked. The door began to open. The creature stepped in. It was wearing the white coat, the costume of authority. Its arms were already opening, reaching for her, exposing the center of its chest. "Mom," it said, stepping into the trap. Nora didn't hesitate. She surged up from the bed, the blanket falling away, and she drove the sharpened blades forward with both hands, with all the strength of her terror, with the force of a mother protecting her life from a monster. It wasn't like the movie. There was no loud bang. There was only a wet, heavy thud as the metal punched through fabric and skin, and a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a surprise. The creature fell. It fell slowly, or time slowed down to accommodate its falling, and Nora watched from a great distance as the thing that had pretended to be her husband, then pretended to be her son, collapsed onto the white floor of the white room. There was blood, red, vivid, shocking against all that white, and the creature's hands were pressed against its chest, trying to hold something in that wanted to get out. Its face was wrong. Its face was still wrong. She had thought, she had hoped, that when she struck it, the mask would slip, that she would see what was really underneath. But the face just kept being wrong, kept being a face she didn't recognize, a face that belonged to no one she loved. "Mom," the creature said. Its voice was weak, wet, wrong. "Mom, why?" And then its face did something she hadn't expected. It crumpled. It twisted. It became a face that was crying, truly crying, in the way that only humans could cry. Messy and ugly and without any calculation. Tears mixed with blood on its cheeks. Its eyes, gray-green, she noticed. Gray-green, like Mark's eyes, found hers and held them. "I just wanted," it said. "I just wanted to hug you. I just wanted..." And then it stopped saying anything. Nora stood over the body for a long time. The scissors were still in her hand, but she couldn't remember how to let go of them. Couldn't remember how her fingers were supposed to work. The room was very white. The blood was very red. The body on the floor was very still. She waited for the face to change. She had been so certain that the face would change, that she would finally see the monster beneath the mask, that she would be vindicated in her vigilance. But the face didn't change. It stayed the same wrong face, the face of a stranger, the face of a creature that had pretended to be something it wasn't. Except that the face was so young, younger than she had noticed before, and the hands. She looked at the creature's hands, splayed on the white floor, and they were Mark's hands. They had Mark's shape, Mark's square nails, the same slight crook in the left pinky finger that Mark had gotten from a childhood accident he could never quite remember. And there was a scar on the creature's forearm, a thin white line, barely visible, exactly where Daniel had cut himself on a broken window when he was 7 years old. She had taken him to the emergency room and held him while they stitched him up and told him that scars were just stories your body told, and the room tilted. Nora felt her knees give way. She was on the floor now next to the body, and she was looking at the face, the wrong face, the monster's face, and it was changing. Not into a monster, into something else, into something she recognized. Her son. This was her son. This had always been her son. "Daniel," she said. The name felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar, a word in a language she had forgotten. "Daniel, wake up." "Daniel, I didn't mean..." But Daniel didn't wake up. Daniel was not going to wake up. Daniel was gone, and she had... The door opened. People came in. People in white coats, people with badges, people who were shouting things she couldn't understand. Someone pried the scissors from her hand, finger by finger, like unfolding a dead thing. Someone else was kneeling next to Daniel, doing things to his chest, speaking quickly into a radio. Someone was crying. Not her. She couldn't cry. Her eyes were dry and hot and wrong. But someone was crying, a woman in scrubs, a woman who kept saying, Dr. Ashby, Dr. Ashby, like a prayer. She looked at her hands. There was blood on them. His blood. Her son's blood. She had felt him die, felt the weight of him against her, felt his hands clutching her shoulders, not in attack, but in desperate, uncomprehending love, felt the exact moment when his grip loosened and he began to fall. He had been trying to hug her. That was the thing she couldn't stop thinking about. He had opened his arms and leaned in and tried to hug her, and she had killed him for it. Nora watched from very far away as they lifted Daniel onto a stretcher. She watched as they wheeled him out of the white room. She watched as the door closed behind them, leaving her alone with the blood and the scissors and the blanket that had hidden her hands while she waited for her son to come close enough to kill. On the small table by the window there was a tray, French toast with strawberries, 63 candles on a separate plate, unlit, a card handwritten that said, "To Mom, with all my love." Daniel, she picked up the card. She read it again, and again, and again. And the words didn't change, and the handwriting didn't change, and the son she had killed didn't come back, and the monster she had seen was gone, replaced by a grief so vast that she couldn't find its edges. Dr. Feldman came to see her 2 days later. By then she had been moved to a different room, still white, still safe, still empty, and she had stopped speaking. What was there to say? What words existed for a woman who had killed her own son because her brain had told her he was a monster? "Mrs. Ashby," Dr. Feldman said. He was an older man, soft-spoken, with glasses that he kept pushing up his nose. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to try to hear me. Can you do that?" She didn't answer. She hadn't answered anything in 2 days. "Your son, Daniel, he didn't make it. I'm so sorry. We tried everything we could, but the damage was too severe." He paused, pushed up his glasses. "He was a good man, your son. A brilliant psychiatrist. He dedicated his career to understanding what happened to you, to finding a treatment that might help. He never gave up on you, Mrs. Ashby. Not even when everyone else said it was hopeless." She looked at the wall. The wall was white. "The scissors," Dr. Feldman continued, looking down at his hands. "We found the marks on the windowsill. You must have been sharpening them for weeks. Safety scissors, Mrs. Ashby. Blunt tips. It shouldn't have been possible to do that much damage. It required a great deal of force, a great deal of determination." She turned her head slowly and looked at him. He had a kind face, Dr. Feldman, a trustworthy face. But she had thought Mark had a trustworthy face too, and Mark had been replaced. And Daniel had been a monster, except Daniel hadn't been a monster. Daniel had been her son, and she had... "The delusion," she said. Her voice was a croak, rusty from disuse. "It's gone." Dr. Feldman leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I can see it now. His face." She closed her eyes and saw Daniel falling, saw his face crumpling, saw the tears mixing with the blood. "I can see that it was him. I couldn't before. It was like looking at a photograph of someone you've never met. I knew the features were right, but they didn't add up to a person. They didn't add up to my son. And now? Now they do." She opened her eyes. "Now I can see him. Now I can remember him. The day he was born, his first steps, the way he used to laugh when Mark tickled him, the time he broke his arm falling off his bicycle and tried not to cry because he wanted to be brave. The memories were coming back, or maybe they had always been there, locked behind a door that her broken brain had refused to open. He was real. He was my son. And She couldn't finish the sentence. There were some things that words couldn't hold. The room they gave her after that was different. It had a window that opened just a crack, just enough to let in the smell of the outside world. It had a bed with sheets that weren't white but a soft, gentle blue. It had a chair where visitors could sit, though no visitors came, because she had no one left to visit her. She had no one left. She thought about this during the long hours between meals, between medication, between the visits from Dr. Feldman, who was trying to understand what had changed, why the delusion had lifted, whether it might return. She thought about the fact that she had once had a husband and a son, and now she had neither, and both absences were her fault. One through an accident that her hands had caused, one through a violence that her broken mind had demanded. Mark had died in the accident. She remembered this now, or she accepted it, which might not be the same thing. She had been driving. The deer had appeared. She had turned the wheel, and the car had rolled. And when she woke up, she was in a hospital bed with tubes in her arms and a hole in her head where something important used to be. The doctors had told her that Mark was dead. She remembered this too now. She remembered a woman in a white coat saying the words, and she remembered not understanding them, and she remembered a young man. Daniel, her Daniel, holding her hand and crying. And she remembered thinking, why is this stranger crying? Why is he holding my hand? That was when it had started. That was when the replacement had begun. Not because Mark had been replaced by a creature, but because the part of her brain that recognized love had been severed from the part that recognized faces. And she had looked at her grieving son and seen only a stranger wearing her son's skin. For 10 years, Daniel had visited her. For 10 years, he had sat outside her door, talking to her through the wood, bringing her meals she wouldn't eat and presents she wouldn't open and love she couldn't feel. For 10 years, he had studied psychiatry and neurology and experimental treatments, searching for a cure that didn't exist. And for 10 years, she had looked at him and seen a monster. She had killed her son because she couldn't remember how to love him. The notebooks were gone. Someone had taken them while she was being moved to the new room. She was glad. She didn't want to read them again, didn't want to see the careful documentation of her delusion, the evidence she had gathered against the monster who had only ever been a boy who missed his mother. But she still had the photo album. Someone had thought she might want it, had placed it on the small table by her new window, and she opened it every day now, turning the pages slowly, memorizing the faces she had forgotten. Here was Daniel at 6 months, sleeping in his crib with his fist in his mouth. Here he was at 2 years, covered in birthday cake, grinning at the camera with frosting in his hair. Here he was at 5, at 10, at 15, growing, changing, becoming the man who would one day stand outside her door and beg her to recognize him. And here on the last page was a photograph she didn't remember seeing before. It must have been added recently, in the years when she wasn't looking, in the years when she thought the album was a fabrication. It showed Daniel in a white coat, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize, smiling the same smile his father used to smile. Underneath, in handwriting she now recognized as his own, were the words, "First day at Green Lawn Psychiatric, going to bring her home." He had spent 10 years trying to bring her home, and she closed the album. She pressed it against her chest, and for the first time since the White Room, since the blood, since the moment when her son's face had finally become her son's face, she cried. She cried for Daniel, who had spent 10 years talking to a door. She cried for Mark, who had died on a dark road while she survived. She cried for the woman she had been before the accident. The woman who could look at her family and feel love instead of suspicion, recognition instead of fear. That woman was gone now. That woman had died on the same road as Mark. And what had survived was something else. Something broken, something dangerous, something that looked at its own child and saw a monster. She cried until there was nothing left, and then she lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a future that contained this knowledge, this grief, this weight. She couldn't imagine it, but that didn't mean it wouldn't come. The dreams were different now. Before, she had dreamed of the accident, the road, the deer, the rolling, the hand hanging limp through the broken window. But now she dreamed of other things. She dreamed of a kitchen in Columbus, yellow curtains, the smell of coffee, Mark reading the newspaper while Daniel ate cereal and complained about homework. She dreamed of a backyard, a sprinkler, a boy running through the water with his arms outstretched, laughing. She dreamed of a hospital room, a different hospital room, where she had held a red-faced newborn and looked into his gray-green eyes and thought, "I will never let anything hurt you." She had lied to him. She had lied to him without knowing she was lying, had looked into those eyes for 30 years and felt nothing, had let her broken brain convince her that he was a threat to be neutralized rather than a child to be loved. In the dreams, she told him she was sorry. In the dreams, he forgave her. But the dreams weren't real, and the apology couldn't reach him. And the forgiveness she imagined was only a story she told herself to make the waking bearable. Dr. Feldman came to see her every Tuesday and Thursday. He was writing a paper, he said, about her case, about the sudden remission of her Capgras syndrome, about the trauma that had triggered it, about the question of whether delusions could be cured by grief or only replaced by it. "There's something I've been wondering," he said one Thursday, pushing up his glasses. "The scissors. You took them from art therapy 3 weeks before it happened. We checked the logs, but you didn't use them immediately. You waited. You sharpened them." She looked at her hands. "I had to be ready." "That's what I'm trying to understand," he said gently. "That level of planning, it suggests a part of you knew exactly what you were doing. It suggests you were waiting for a specific moment." "I don't know how to answer that," she said, and it was true. She didn't know what was real anymore, what was memory and what was delusion, where the lies her brain had told her ended and the truth began. "I just knew I needed them to protect myself from the creature." The creature being Daniel, yes. The word was a stone in her mouth. The creature being my son. Dr. Feldman wrote something in his notebook. She wondered what it said. She wondered if it would end up in his paper if someday medical students would read about the woman who had killed her son because she couldn't recognize his face. "Do you think—" She stopped, started again. "Do you think he knew, at the end, that I was his mother?" Dr. Feldman was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "I think he knew you were ill. I think he never stopped believing that the real you was still in there somewhere, waiting to come back. And I think—" He pushed up his glasses. "I think that's why he went into that room. Not because he thought you would hurt him, because he believed, even after 10 years, that love was stronger than illness. That if he could just reach you, just touch you, just make you see." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "He was wrong," she said. "Yes." Dr. Feldman closed his notebook. "He was wrong." On the anniversary of Daniel's death, Nora asked to visit his grave. It was an unusual request. She hadn't left the facility in years, hadn't expressed any desire to go anywhere. But Dr. Feldman approved it. He said it might be therapeutic. He said it might provide closure. He used words like processing and integration and acceptance, and Nora nodded along, though she didn't believe any of it. The cemetery was in Columbus, not far from the house where she had raised her son. The house where Mark had left wet towels on the bathroom floor for 37 years. The house she would never see again because she couldn't be trusted. Because her brain was broken. Because she had killed the only person left who loved her. Daniel's grave was next to Mark's. This seemed right. They had been so close, father and son, bound by their shared bewilderment at the woman who had slowly stopped recognizing them. She remembered, really remembered now, not the false memories of the creature, but the true memories of her life. How they had whispered to each other in the kitchen after she had accused Mark of being an imposter for the first time. How they had held each other and cried when the doctors explained what was happening to her. How Daniel had promised his dying father that he would take care of her, that he would find a way to bring her back, that he would never give up. He had kept that promise. He had kept it until the moment she drove the scissors into his chest. The headstone was simple, gray granite, engraved with his name and his dates, and a phrase she didn't recognize. He never stopped believing. Daniel, she said. The wind took her words and carried them somewhere she couldn't follow. I remember you now. I remember everything. I remember the way you used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms. I remember teaching you to ride a bicycle in the driveway. I remember the look on your face when you got into medical school, how proud you were, how scared. She touched the headstone. It was cold. I remember that I loved you. I remember that I stopped being able to feel it. But I never stopped. I never meant to. She couldn't finish. There were some sentences that had no endings, some thoughts that broke apart before they could be completed. She knelt in the grass beside her son's grave and stayed there until the orderlies came to take her back to the place where she would live out the rest of her days. The white rooms, the blue sheets, the window that opened just a crack, the memories that had returned too late to save anyone. The room was white in the way that rooms are white when someone has decided that white is the absence of everything and therefore safe. Nora Ashby sat on the edge of her bed. It was her bed. She had claimed it. She had rights to it. And watched the window where the light came in. Beyond the window, she could see the courtyard where the other patients walked in circles. Beyond the courtyard, she could see trees. And beyond the trees, the suggestion of a world she would probably never rejoin. She had made her peace with this. Some doors, once closed, stay closed. Some absences become permanent. But she could still remember. That was something. She could close her eyes and see Daniel's face. His real face. Not the monster mask her brain had invented. And feel, finally, the love she had been unable to feel while he was alive. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was what she had. And she would carry it with her, this terrible gift, this grief that was also a kind of healing until the day when she closed her eyes and didn't open them again. And whatever waited on the other side of that darkness, whether it was nothing or something or Daniel standing with his arms open, ready at last to receive the hug his mother owed him, decided what came next. Until then, she would remember. It was the least she could do. It was the only thing left. Story 7. The airport had the quality of a place where decisions were made for you, which should have been the first warning. But Alice Calloway was 22 and had never been to Europe before, and the fluorescent lights made everything seem both urgent and unreal. She had been standing at the baggage claim for 40 minutes, watching the same 4 suitcases circle endlessly, when the woman touched her elbow. The woman introduced herself as Claudette Renard, silver hair and an intricate chignon, pearls, a camel coat, with the kind of precision that suggested either great wealth or great vanity. Her smile contained no warmth whatsoever, which Alice mistook for European reserve. The man behind her, tall and vaguely handsome, in the way of someone who had been beautiful 40 years ago, did not introduce himself at all. He simply took Alice's bag with a gesture that managed to be both courteous and possessive. There had been a complication with the housing, Claudette explained. A flood in the dormitory. The university had sent them. They were on the approved host family list, had even donated the Renard Language Center 5 years ago. Alice's first instinct was to check her phone, but the battery had died somewhere over the Atlantic. The man was already walking toward the exit with her luggage, and fatigue made everything seem reasonable. She would charge her phone in the car. She would call the university once she arrived. The car was a Mercedes, black and silent. Alice sat in the back watching unfamiliar streets slide past, her dead phone heavy in her pocket. Claudette and the man, her husband presumably, spoke quietly in French. Once he glanced at her in the rearview mirror with an expression of such naked assessment that Alice felt her skin prickle. But when she met his eyes, he smiled blandly and returned his attention to the road. Claudette noticed her fidgeting with the phone and indicated a charger beside her. Alice's phone powered on, and she typed out a quick message to her mother. Made it. Housing changed, but the university set me up with a host family. We'll call tomorrow when I'm less jet-lagged. Love you. She hit send and watched the message turn blue, relief flooding through her. Claudette's voice came from the front seat, approving, though Alice had not mentioned sending the text. The observation landed with peculiar weight, but exhaustion dulled her alarm. By then the city was disappearing behind them, the car moving deeper into countryside she didn't recognize. The house, when they arrived, was not in the city. They had driven for nearly an hour through increasingly rural landscape, the modern apartment blocks giving way to old stone walls and narrow roads lined with plane trees. The house itself stood alone at the end of a long gravel drive, 3 stories of pale limestone with dark shutters and a slate roof that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. There was a quality of isolation to the place that Alice noticed immediately, the way one notices the temperature dropping in a room. But by then, Claudette already had her by the arm and was guiding her up the stone steps. You must be exhausted. We'll show you to your room. Inside, the house was furnished with the kind of expensive antiques that made Alice afraid to touch anything. The air held a peculiar quality, lemon polish layered over something older, mustier. Beneath it all, a faint sweetness that might have been old perfume, and something else, something metallic that seemed to drift through the rooms like a whisper. Persian rugs and deep burgundies and golds covered polished wood floors. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the hallway. Portraits mostly, stern-faced people in clothing from another century. But it was the photographs that caught her attention. Dozens of them arranged on every available surface. All of the same young woman. Dark chestnut hair, pale skin, a particular shape to her smile that seemed both familiar and unsettling. Or was it the same woman? Alice paused, studying the photographs more closely. In the older silver frames, the girl looked slightly different. The nose perhaps a fraction wider, the chin less pronounced. In the more recent photos, the features had sharpened, refined themselves. The lighting was different in each, making comparison difficult. But there was something not quite right about the progression, as if she were looking at similar people rather than one person aging. Claudette identified her as their daughter, Elena. The man, Bertrand, as Alice would learn, had disappeared with her luggage, his footsteps echoing somewhere in the upper floors. Alice stood in the entrance hall, trying to calculate how long it would take to walk back to the main road, how she would explain to the university that she'd abandoned their generous donors on her first day. She offered the expected compliment about Elena's beauty, and Claudette's response came with quiet satisfaction. Alice would have Elena's room. They had kept it just as it was. The room was on the second floor, accessed by a curving staircase with an ornate banister that felt slightly sticky beneath Alice's palm. Claudette opened the door with a key from her pocket. The door had been locked, Alice noted, and gestured her inside. It was a young woman's room, or had been 20 years ago. The bed had a white eyelet coverlet. The wallpaper showed tiny rosebuds on a cream background. A vanity with an oval mirror held an array of brushes and perfume bottles, their silver tops tarnished with age. The smell here was stronger. That cloying sweetness like roses left too long in water, mixed with something chemical that might have been mothballs or preservative. Everything was clean, obsessively so, as if someone dusted it daily. But there was a staleness to the air that spoke of disuse, of a stage set waiting for its actress. The window overlooked the back garden where Alice could see a tall hedge, and beyond it, nothing but fields. Claudette indicated the bathroom, mentioned dinner at 7, their regular schedule. Then came the request for Alice's phone to add the Wi-Fi password, she explained. The connection could be tricky. She held out her hand with such casual authority that Alice found herself unlocking the phone and passing it over before she'd consciously decided to do so. Claudette smiled, slipping it into her pocket, promising to return it with the password written down. She left, and Alice heard the sound of the key turning in the lock. She stood very still, listening. Footsteps receded down the hallway. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. After a moment, she tried the door handle, knowing what she would find. It did not turn. Perhaps they had locked it by accident. Perhaps it was for her safety, as Claudette would later claim. But Alice's hands were shaking as she returned to the window and tested the latch. It was painted shut, or nailed. She could not tell which. The glass was old, wavy, and through it the garden looked distorted, like something seen underwater. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She told herself she was overtired. But when she finally lay down on the white eyelet coverlet, fully clothed, unable to imagine undressing in this room, she did not sleep. Instead, she thought about her phone in Claudette's pocket, about the lock on the door, about those photographs with their subtly shifting faces. The knock came at precisely 7 o'clock. The lock clicked, and Claudette appeared, already dressed for dinner, in a dove-gray dress with a cameo at the throat. She did not return the phone. Alice followed her down to a dining room dominated by a mahogany table set for 3. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier. Bertrand stood when she entered, pulling out her chair with the same gesture he had used with her luggage. Courteous, possessive, inevitable. The meal was elaborate. Fish in a cream sauce that tasted faintly of tarragon, vegetables arranged with the precision of a still life. The flavors were perfect, restaurant quality, but there was something disturbing about the way Claudette watched every bite Alice took, her eyes tracking the fork from plate to mouth with an intensity that made swallowing difficult. Wine appeared in her glass before she could protest, a white that was too sweet for Alice's taste, almost dessert-like. Claudette noted that Elena had always preferred the sweeter wines, as if this explained everything, as if Alice would naturally develop the same taste. They asked careful questions about her studies, her family, her plans. She answered mechanically, trying to focus on the conversation, aware of them watching her, cataloging her responses, her posture, the way she held her fork. Then Claudette's attention fixed on Alice's hair. The blonde color didn't suit her at all, she announced. She had an excellent stylist who could come tomorrow. A rich chestnut would be lovely with Alice's complexion. Alice's protest died in her throat as Claudette moved on, already discussing appointments with Bertrand as if the matter were settled. After dinner, Claudette walked her back upstairs. At the door to Elena's room, Alice had begun thinking of it this way, could not stop thinking of it this way. She finally asked for her phone. "Tomorrow," Claudette said. The Wi-Fi was still being difficult, and she didn't want Alice to waste battery trying to connect. "But Alice should call her parents," she protested weakly, "to let them know." Claudette's response was gentle but final. Alice had already texted them. They knew she was safe. That was what mattered. The smile that followed suggested she expected no further questions. And before Alice could formulate a response, she was alone again, and the lock was turning, and the room seemed smaller than it had that afternoon. Alice did not sleep that night. She lay on the white eyelet coverlet and listened to the house settle around her, the creak of old wood, the sound of footsteps in the hallway at odd hours. Twice she heard voices, low and urgent, too muffled to make out words. She thought about the text she'd sent her mother, about how Claudette had said good before Alice mentioned sending it, and understood with creeping horror that they had been reading over her shoulder, or perhaps they'd done this before, knew exactly what a frightened girl would text in those first moments. In the morning, Claudette unlocked the door at 8 precisely, carrying a breakfast tray. Coffee, croissants, jam in a small porcelain dish, everything arranged just so. She announced the stylist would arrive at 10 and laid out a dress for Alice to wear, a floral print in muted colors, the style from decades ago. Alice tried once more, choosing her words carefully. She needed her phone back. She needed to call the university to confirm the housing situation. Claudette's agreement came easily. Of course, after the stylist. They had so much to do today, and she'd hate for Alice to spend it all on administrative calls. The university knew exactly where she was. She promised. The woman who arrived at 10 carried a professional-looking case and spoke rapid French to Claudette, while studying Alice with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. She touched Alice's hair, lifting strands to the light, frowning. More French, more discussion. And then Alice was being guided to a chair brought in from somewhere else, a sheet draped around her shoulders. Alice made one final protest about not wanting to dye her hair, but her voice sounded weak even to herself, and no one responded. The process took hours. The chemical smell made her eyes water. She watched in the vanity mirror as her blonde hair darkened section by section, transforming into a color she did not recognize. The stylist worked with grim efficiency, consulting a photograph that Claudette held up periodically. One of the pictures from downstairs, Alice realized, of Elena, matching her to Elena, making her into Elena. When it was done, she barely recognized herself. The woman in the mirror had dark chestnut hair that fell in waves to her shoulders, styled in a way that seemed both old-fashioned and strangely ageless. The color suited her, she realized with a jolt of horror, brought out the green in her eyes, made her skin look porcelain rather than pale. She looked pretty. The thought arrived unbidden, and Alice felt her stomach turn. She didn't want to look pretty like this. She didn't want to see the appeal of what they'd done to her. But the face in the mirror was undeniably lovely, and for just a moment, she understood how Elena must have looked. How all the Elenas must have looked, each one a variation on this same impossible standard. Claudette stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, studying the reflection with an expression of deep satisfaction. Perfect, she breathed. Absolutely perfect. The days began to blur after that. Each morning, breakfast at 8. Each afternoon, some new adjustment. They threw away her sneakers, replacing them with delicate flats that Elena must have worn. They took her backpack with her laptop and textbooks, promising to keep them safe, storing them somewhere she could not access. Claudette began what she called coaching sessions. She would stand behind Alice as she walked across the bedroom, critiquing her gait. No, too heavy. Elena had a lighter step, almost as if she were floating. Try again from the door. Alice would walk again and again until Claudette was satisfied, until her own natural stride had been replaced by something affected and deliberate. Better. We'll practice that again tomorrow. They made her practice Elena's signature, copying it from old birthday cards until the loops and curves became automatic. Claudette brought out a clipboard where she recorded everything. Alice's measurements, her weight checked daily on an antique scale in the bathroom, notes about her posture, her speech patterns, her responses. The frame is a challenge, Claudette murmured one afternoon, measuring Alice's shoulders with the cloth tape. Narrower than Elena's. And the hips. We'll need to adjust those proportions. The diet will help, but structurally. She made a note on her clipboard with the detached precision of a director blocking a scene. They made her try on Elena's dresses, and Alice noticed immediately how they fit wrong. Too loose in the chest, too tight in the waist, the shoulders slightly off. Claudette noticed, too, her mouth tightening with displeasure. "We'll have this taken in here," she said, pinching the fabric at Alice's chest. "And let out here. Though really, you need to gain weight. 3 kilos at minimum." Elena was never this thin. She said it as if Alice's body were an inferior draft that needed revision. At meals, the portions grew larger. Claudette would watch, counting bites, insisting Alice finish everything. The food was always rich. Cream sauces, butter-soaked vegetables, desserts that sat heavy in the stomach. When Alice pushed back from the table, still hungry but unable to eat more, Claudette would smile with a patience that felt threatening. "We'll try again at dinner. You'll learn." Elena never left food on her plate. Claudette taught her to style her hair the way Elena had worn it, demonstrated the proper way to apply lipstick, supervised her choices from the wardrobe until Alice learned to choose correctly without being told. When Alice selected the wrong dress one morning, a yellow one instead of the blue, Claudette's expression turned glacial. "That's not right. Elena never wore yellow." "We'll have to rehearse your wardrobe selections again tomorrow until you understand the role." The role. As if Alice were an actress learning lines, as if Elena were a character to be performed rather than a person who had died. And always, always they called her Elena. At first she corrected them. Then she stopped correcting them because it made Bertrand's expression turn cold. Made Claudette say things like, "Let's rehearse your introduction again, shall we? I'll ask your name, and you'll respond properly this time." It was easier to respond, to let the name wash over her, to pretend she didn't notice how their faces brightened when she did. Bertrand functioned like a stage manager, arranging the props of her new life, moving furniture in the bedroom to match old photographs, placing Elena's jewelry on the vanity in specific positions, ensuring every detail matched his memory of how things had been. "The perfume bottle goes here," he would say, moving it 2 inches to the left. Elena always kept it exactly here. He made her practice sitting at the vanity, brushing her hair with Elena's silver brush, 100 strokes every night, just as Elena had done. When Alice's technique was wrong, when she held the brush at the wrong angle or moved too quickly, Bertrand would demonstrate, his hands hovering over hers, guiding her movements until they matched whatever phantom choreography he remembered. Her phone never reappeared, but periodically Claudette would show her messages that had been sent from it, breezy updates to her parents about how wonderful France was, how much she loved her host family, how she was thinking of staying an extra semester. The messages sounded like her, but weren't her, and reading them gave Alice the vertiginous sensation of watching her own life continue without her participation. "Your mother is so pleased you're happy," Claudette said, showing her the latest exchange. "She says you sound more mature already." The neighbors provided the first confirmation that her growing horror was not paranoia. Claudette allowed her to walk in the garden, supervised always, and one afternoon an elderly woman passed on the road beyond the hedge, walking a small dog. She glanced toward the garden and saw Alice, and her face went white. Not surprise, recognition. And more than recognition, terror. She hurried away, dragging the dog, glancing back twice with an expression that made Alice's breath catch. Claudette dismissed her as Madame Olivier, not quite right in the head, seeing ghosts everywhere. But 2 days later, a man delivering groceries glimpsed Alice through the window and dropped the box he was carrying, vegetables rolling across the gravel. Claudette rushed to close the curtains, laughing about how clumsy he was. But Alice had seen his face, had seen recognition and fear and something like grief. They knew Elena. They had known what happened to Elena, and seeing Alice looking like Elena meant they were watching it happen again. That evening, when the wind shifted, Alice caught that metallic smell again, stronger now, drifting through her bedroom window from somewhere at the back of the property. It made her think of raw meat, of rust, of something burning that should not be burned. That night, Alice tried to stay awake, tried to listen for anything that might help her understand. And she heard them, Claudette and Bertrand in the hallway outside her locked door, speaking in low voices that carried in the old house's strange acoustics. She's adapting well, better than the last one. She's still too thin, 3 kilos at least. The measurements are all wrong. I'm increasing portions. The diet plan is working just slowly. Give it time. We don't have time. Her parents will expect a video call eventually. The texts won't work forever. They will. They always have. People see what they want to see. A pause, and then Bertrand again, his voice rougher. The nose is wrong. And the chin. The bone structure. She'll never be right without corrections. The surgeon can come next month. We need to wait until she's stable, until she understands her role. Otherwise, we get another Catherine. Catherine. The name meant nothing to Alice, but the way they said it, with disgust, with disappointment, made her skin crawl. Catherine was weak. This one is different. I can feel it. We thought that about Catherine. We thought that about Margot, too. Margot. 2 names now, 2 failures, 2 predecessors. Alice pressed her ear harder against the door, hardly breathing. This one will work, Claudette said with finality. She has to. I'm getting too old for this. We're both getting too old. Their footsteps retreated, and Alice was left alone with the understanding that she was not the first, that there had been others, that Catherine and Margot, and possibly more, had stood in this room, slept in this bed, looked in this mirror, and watched themselves become someone else. She began to search the room more carefully, looking for evidence, for messages, for anything the others might have left behind. In the back of the wardrobe, behind the rows of dresses, she found it. Names scratched into the wood with something sharp. 3 of them. But the formatting was strange, as if carved by different hands at different times, in different states of mind. MS 2019, CW 2021, H 2023. Just initials and years, not full names. Perhaps they'd been too afraid to leave more. Perhaps they'd hoped their families would never need to search for them because their families didn't know where to search. Alice added her own with a broken piece of jewelry wire she'd found in the vanity drawer, pressing hard enough to make the wood splinter. IC 2025. But even as she carved it, she wondered if it mattered, if anyone would ever see it, if the next girl would add her own name to the list, or if this would be the room where the list ended, because Claudette finally got what she wanted. The revelation came not through investigation, but through accident. Claudette had taken her to the garden to cut flowers, supervised as always, and Alice had wandered slightly too far toward the back of the property, where the manicured lawn gave way to wilder growth. The incinerator was visible from there, a large metal structure behind a utility shed, and something about it drew her attention. Perhaps the smell, faint but distinctive, or perhaps the careful way it had been concealed behind a hedge. She moved closer before Claudette could stop her, and saw what lay beside it. A pile of items waiting to be burned. Clothes, mostly. A stained hoodie, worn sneakers, jeans with holes in the knees. Not the kind of clothes a study-abroad student would pack. Rougher, cheaper. The wardrobe of someone traveling light, someone who owned very little. A backpack that looked like it had come from a thrift store. And beneath them, partially visible, something that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. Not a passport this time, but an ID card. French laminated. The kind issued to asylum seekers. The photo showed a young woman with dark circles under her eyes, her expression wary. The name meant nothing to Alice, but the birth date made her perhaps 20. A refugee, Alice realized. Someone far from home with a few connections. Someone whose disappearance might be written off as another tragedy in a system that failed people like her constantly. Alice reached for it before thinking, and Claudette's hand clamped down on her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't touch that," she commanded. It was rubbish, things that needed to be disposed of. But Alice understood now. The others hadn't been students like her. They'd been vulnerable in different ways. Refugees, maybe runaways. Women's society had already half forgotten. Women whose families, if they had families, didn't have the resources or legal standing to demand proper investigations. Women who could vanish and leave barely a ripple. Until Alice, a blonde American student from a good family, a girl whose parents would call the university, who had paperwork and permissions and institutional backing. The Renards' first mistake. They did not speak as Claudette dragged her back to the house, her grip on Alice's arm like iron. In the kitchen, Bertrand was waiting, and from the look on his face, he knew what had happened. Bertrand's expression darkened. He looked at Alice with something between irritation and assessment, as if she were a piece of equipment that had malfunctioned. "They weren't ready to discuss this yet," he said finally. "But perhaps it was better this way. Honesty might help her understand." Alice's voice came from somewhere distant, asking what there was to understand. Claudette released her arm and moved to stand beside Bertrand, the two of them united in whatever came next. She explained it simply. Alice was not the first, and the others had failed. They couldn't be Elena, no matter how hard the Renards tried. Catherine was too resistant. Margot was too weak. Heather. She trailed off, shaking her head. Heather almost worked. Very close. But in the end, she broke character at a crucial moment, and they couldn't allow her to continue. The casual way she discussed it, as if failure were simply a matter of poor performance in a play, made Alice's mind reel. Breaking character. As if their entire lives had become a theatrical production, with Claudette as director, determining who deserved to continue in the role. Alice's question came out barely audible. What happened to them? Bertrand gestured vaguely toward the back of the property. They were released from their suffering, he said. The Renards weren't monsters. They gave them opportunities. The girls simply couldn't fulfill them. Released. The euphemism was obscene, but Alice understood it now. The incinerator, the ID card, the clothes waiting to be burned. Girls who had come to France looking for safety or opportunity or simply survival, who had trusted the wrong people, who had disappeared into a system that barely acknowledged they'd existed in the first place. And then Alice, asking the question that mattered most. Why her? Why risk taking someone people would actually look for? The answer came from Claudette, and it was chillingly simple. They were running out of time. The previous girls had been practice, refinement. But they were old now, both of them, and patience had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Alice was perfect. The right age, the right build, the right coloring with minimal adjustment needed. They'd been watching the university's incoming students for months, waiting for the right one. When they saw Alice's photograph in the program materials, they knew. She was worth the risk. Why? The question came out as barely more than a breath. Claudette moved to the kitchen table, where a photograph album lay open. She beckoned Alice closer, and Alice found herself obeying, her legs moving without conscious decision. The photograph showed Elena, the real Elena, at various ages, a child, a teenager, a young woman. And in the later photos, Alice could see what she'd noticed downstairs in the hallway. The subtle changes in features, the way one photo didn't quite match the next. Our daughter wanted to leave us, Claudette said, her voice soft with old grief. She was engaged to be married, a good match, everything arranged. But she decided she wanted something else. Paris, independence, foolishness. She tried to run away, Bertrand. We had to stop her, for her own good. But there was an accident. A staircase. We didn't mean... It doesn't matter what we meant, Claudette interrupted sharply. What matters is what happened. Elena died, and we lost everything. But then we realized we could fix it. With the right girl, the right approach, we could bring her back. Not perfectly. Not at first, but close enough. And each time we try, we get closer. Alice stared at the photographs, at the subtle variations that she now understood were different women's faces, each one altered to approximate Elena, each one photographed and displayed as if the transformation had succeeded. The insanity of it left her breathless. Claudette's correction came swiftly. They weren't insane. They were parents who lost their child, and Alice was going to help them get her back. She would learn the part properly this time. With the right direction, the right preparation, she would become Elena. It was really quite simple. She just had to commit to the role. She said it as if Alice were an understudy who'd been given the opportunity of a lifetime, as if she should be grateful for the chance to perform. They locked her in the basement that night, not the bedroom anymore. The basement where a surgical table waited, where bright lights hung from the ceiling, where instruments gleamed on steel trays. Claudette's voice was almost kind as she explained, just until Alice calmed down, until she understood that this was happening whether she cooperated or not. Cooperation would make it easier. They had learned that from experience. Alice sat on the surgical table after they left, her mind racing through impossible calculations. The house was isolated. Her phone was gone, her identity already being erased through cheerful text messages to her parents. The university trusted the Renards implicitly. Why wouldn't they? The Renards had donated the building. They had institutional legitimacy, social standing, the kind of respectability that made questioning them seem absurd. But unlike the others, Alice mattered to people who had power. Her parents would call eventually. The university would follow up. She was supposed to check in with her program coordinator, attend classes, participate in activities. When none of that happened, when she remained invisible week after week, surely someone would notice. Surely someone would come. Except the Renards had thought of that too. They had her phone, her passwords, her entire digital life. They could impersonate her indefinitely. And by the time anyone grew suspicious enough to demand proof of life, the surgical corrections would be complete. She would look like Elena, sound like Elena, and in the video calls, her parents would see their daughter with slightly different features and believe the camera quality was poor. Believe she'd lost weight from stress. Believe whatever explanation was offered because parents wanted to believe their children were safe. And if the deception failed, if her parents somehow grew suspicious and contacted authorities, those authorities were already in the Renards' pocket. The investigation would go nowhere. The American embassy would be told she'd run off with a boyfriend, or fallen in with a bad crowd, or simply decided to drop out and travel. Young people did impulsive things. The case would close. The window in the basement was at ground level, the glass reinforced with the wire mesh. Alice examined it carefully, looking for weaknesses. The mesh was secured with screws, old ones, slightly rusted. She had no tools, but the surgical tray held instruments, and surely one of them might work. She selected a scalpel, tested its edge against the screw head. Too narrow, but perhaps if she used the handle as a lever. The work was slow and silent, the screws resisting, but she had nothing else to do and all night to do it. One screw came free after 20 minutes of effort, then another. The mesh loosened slightly, enough to confirm this might actually work. But even as she worked, part of her mind was calculating the futility. Where would she go? The nearest town was kilometers away. She had no shoes except flimsy flats, no coat, no identification. And she'd seen the neighbors' faces, had seen the terror and the refusal to help. The community knew. They had known for years. The disappeared migrants, the missing refugee, the runaway who never surfaced. All of it had happened in plain sight. And no one had spoken up because speaking up meant going against the Renards, and going against the Renards meant going against power itself. Still, she worked through the night, driven by the simple human need to try, to not surrender. 3 more screws came free, then 2 more. The final screw was jammed, immovable, but the mesh was loose enough that she could bend it back, create an opening. She was halfway through the window, the wire mesh scraping against her ribs, when she heard the basement door unlock. Claudette stood at the top of the stairs in a dressing gown, her hair still in its perfect chignon despite the late hour. Behind her, Bertrand held a flashlight. They regarded Alice calmly without surprise, as if this too was something they'd seen before. Claudette's sigh was theatrical, disappointed. And Alice had been doing so well. Alice dropped to the ground outside, her ankle twisting on the uneven earth. Pain shot up her leg, but she ran anyway, limping, the garden spinning around her in the darkness. Behind her, she heard Bertrand's voice, not shouting, just calling out with horrible reasonableness. There was nowhere to go, he reminded her, using Elena's name. She knew this. Elena, not Alice. Already Elena in his mind, the transformation already complete before the first surgical cut. The hedge maze closed around her, every path looking the same in the darkness. She crashed through branches, thorns tearing at her nightgown, at her skin, found the field beyond, but her ankle buckled with each step. The road appeared, and Alice ran toward the cluster of lights that marked the nearest houses. Madame Olivier's was closest. She pounded on the door, screaming in French and English, begging. The door opened. Madame Olivier stood there in her nightgown, her face ancient and sad. Behind her, Alice could see a warm kitchen, a telephone on the wall. Safety. So close. Alice's desperate plea tumbled out. They had killed the others. They were going to kill her. Please help. Madame Olivier looked past her to where Claudette and Bertrand were approaching, walking side by side like a couple out for an evening stroll. When she looked back at Alice, her eyes filled with tears. She spoke in heavily accented English, her voice breaking. She had grandchildren. 3 of them. The Renards knew where they lived, where they went to school. Did Alice understand? She had grandchildren. The door closed. The lock turned. Alice tried the next house and the next, but no one answered. In some, she could see faces at windows watching, and then the curtains would close. They all knew. The whole village knew. And they had all made the same calculation Madame Olivier had made. Their safety was worth more than a stranger's life. Claudette and Bertrand caught up to her in front of the 4th house. Bertrand's hands on her shoulders were gentle, almost kind. Claudette brushed the hair back from Alice's face, tucking it behind her ear the way a mother might. Her voice was soft, understanding. Did Alice see too? There really was nowhere to go. This was her home. They were her family. The sooner she accepted that, the easier everything would become. They walked her back, one on each side, supporting her weight because of the ankle. The house rose ahead of them, every window dark except the one they'd left lit in the basement. In the basement, a syringe waited on the surgical tray. Alice saw it and understood. And the understanding was worse than the fear, because it meant they had prepared for this, had known she would try to escape, had already planned the next step. "This will help you sleep," Claudette said, filling the syringe with practiced efficiency. "Tomorrow we'll start preparing for the corrections. The surgeon can come next week instead of next month. We've decided not to wait. You're close enough now. Just a few adjustments to the facial structure, and you'll be perfect, ready for opening night." "Please," Alice whispered. "Please don't do this." "Hush. Every girl says that at first. But you'll see. Once it's done, once you're really Elena, you'll understand. You'll be grateful. This is the performance of a lifetime." The needle slid into her arm, and Alice felt the cold spread through her veins. The room tilted, Claudette's face hovering above her, already blurring. "Sleep now, Elena. Tomorrow's an important day." But Alice fought the darkness, fought to stay conscious, because she knew if she surrendered to it, she might not wake up as herself. The surgical lights were so bright, impossibly bright, and through them she could see her reflection in the polished chrome, could see the dark hair, the features that were being sculpted into someone else's face. She thought about Catherine Worth and Margot and Heather, about whether they had fought this moment or surrendered to it, about whether fighting mattered when the outcome was already determined. She thought about her mother reading cheerful texts from a daughter who was already gone, about how long it would take before anyone questioned why she never video called, never came home for holidays. She thought about the names scratched in the wardrobe. Not names, just initials, because the others had known better than to leave evidence that could be traced back to families who might come looking. MSCWH. Margot and Catherine and Heather, who had protected their loved ones even in their final moments, had tried to ensure that no one else would follow them into this house. But Alice was different. Her parents knew where she was supposed to be. The university had her housing assignment. If she vanished completely, there would be questions. The Renards' first mistake was choosing someone who would be missed. Unless it wasn't a mistake. Unless they were so confident in their power, in their ability to manipulate every system meant to protect her, that they believed they could get away with it, and perhaps they were right to be confident. 3 women had died here, and no one had come. No investigation had been launched. The village knew and had said nothing. The authorities knew and had done nothing. Why would Alice be any different? The darkness was winning now, pulling her under. But before it took her completely, she had one last terrible thought. What if it worked? What if the surgery succeeded? What if the programming took hold? What if she woke up and looked in the mirror and saw Elena, thought like Elena, became Elena so completely that Alice Calloway was just a bad dream she'd had once, a wrong life she'd lived before finding her way home? What if the worst thing wasn't dying, but surviving as someone else? The thought followed her down into unconsciousness, where Claudette's voice echoed from very far away. "We'll get it right this time. I can feel it. This is the one." And perhaps it was. Perhaps Alice Calloway was exactly the right girl, with exactly the right features, exactly the right vulnerability. Perhaps in a week or a month or a year, she would stand in the garden and wave to the neighbors, and they would see Elena, only Elena, and the ghost of the blonde girl from California would be gone as completely as if she'd never existed. The house stood in its fields like it had stood for 100 years, like it would stand for 100 more. In the morning, the mail would arrive, the groceries would be delivered, life would continue in its ordinary way. Madame Olivier would walk her dog past the house and would not look up at the windows. The university would receive updates from Alice's phone and mark her as enrolled, participating, thriving. The chief of police, if he thought about the house at all, would think of his cousin Bertrand and the generous campaign contributions and the many favors exchanged over the years. And in the basement, a surgeon would arrive to begin the corrections, the careful reshaping of flesh and bone, to match a photograph of a girl who died 20 years ago, who was dying again and again in the bodies of women who made the mistake of being young and vulnerable and alone. Somewhere far away, Alice's mother was sleeping peacefully, comforted by cheerful texts from her daughter who sounded so mature and so happy. Somewhere far away, the families of MS, CW, and H were still grieving, still hoping, still believing that maybe their daughters had simply chosen to disappear, had found new lives somewhere beyond reach. Somewhere far away, other young women were packing for study abroad programs, excited for adventure, trusting in the institutions meant to protect them, never imagining that those same institutions could become the mechanisms of their destruction. But here, in this house at the end of a long gravel drive, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the quiet breathing of a girl who was slowly forgetting her own name. The performance was about to begin, the final rehearsal. And this time, Claudette believed they would get it absolutely right.